The train didn't so much arrive in cold water as it surrendered to it, hissing and groaning to a stop like something tired of fighting the wind that came down off the Bitterroot Range. Clara Hayes stood in the narrow aisle of the passenger car a moment longer than she needed to, watching the platform through the grimy window, trying to find the man's face among the handful of people gathered there. She had a photograph of him folded into the lining of her coat, a stiff, unsmiling portrait that a photographer in Ohio had taken 3 years prior, according to the letter that came with it. 3 years was a long time for a face to stay the same. She told herself that. She told herself a lot of things in the 11 days it took the train to cross half a continent. Mama. Evan's voice was small, careful, the voice of a 5-year-old boy who had learned that the world answered better to caution than to noise. Is that him? I don't know yet, sweetheart. She didn't know. That was the truth of it, plain and unadorned, and she had given up trying to dress it in anything prettier. Lily, 3 years old and not given to caution of any kind, had her small fist wound so tightly into the fabric of Clara's skirt that her knuckles had gone white, and she made a low, unhappy sound every time the train lurched. The conductor called the stop. Coldwater, Montana. End of the line, more or less. There was a spur further west that went on to the mining camps, but for passengers, this was where the railroad's interest in you ended, and the territory's indifference began. Clara gathered the children and the one carpet bag that held everything she still owned in the world, and she stepped down onto the platform, and the cold hit her like a hand. It wasn't just the temperature, though the temperature was bad enough, a hard, dry cold that came in off the plains and didn't care how thin a woman's coat was. It was the quality of the air itself, the way the whole town seemed to be holding its breath and watching her. A dozen or so people stood near the station house, and every one of them turned to look at the woman with 2 children getting off the train alone, and not one of them stepped forward. She scanned the platform again. No man matching the photograph. No man at all who seemed to be looking for anyone. Mrs. Hayes. She turned, hope rising fast and foolish in her chest, and found herself looking at the station master, a stooped, gray-whiskered man with ink-stained fingers and the kind of face that had delivered bad news so many times it had stopped being able to soften it. I'm Clara Hayes. You're expecting Mr. Sorrel Carter. Yes. The hope in her chest started to curdle into something else. Has something happened to him? The station master looked for a moment like a man wishing very hard he were somewhere else. Mr. Carter sold his claim back in October and lit out for Idaho. Owed money to half the town when he went. I'm sorry, ma'am. I figured somebody would have wired you. Nobody had wired her. Clara had spent 11 days and the last of her savings crossing a continent to marry a man who had been gone for 2 months, who had perhaps never intended to be here at all, who had taken whatever coin he could scrape together and run from his debts the same way. She understood now with a kind of slow, sick clarity he had likely run from every commitment he'd ever made. I see, she said, because there was nothing else to say that wouldn't break something in her that she needed to keep whole, at least until she got the children somewhere warm. Evan's small hand found hers. He hadn't understood all of it, but he'd understood enough. He always understood enough. And his face had gone tight and pale in that way it did when he was trying very hard not to cry in front of people. Lily, mercifully, was too cold and too tired to register the catastrophe unfolding around her. She only pressed her face into Clara's hip and whimpered. Is there somewhere I could... Clara started and stopped because she didn't actually know how to finish the sentence. Somewhere she could, what? Stay. She had $4 and some odd cents. Send a telegram? To whom? There was no family waiting on the other end of any wire she could send. Her mother was 8 years dead, her father longer than that, and the sister who might once have taken her in had stopped writing back after Clara married the first time. The marriage that had given her these children and then put her in the ground beside it. Though it had been the husband who went into the ground, fever, 2 winters past, and Clara who'd been left standing. There's a boarding house, the station master said, not unkindly. Mrs. Pruitt runs it. I expect she'll have a room. Thank you. She did not say what she was thinking, which was that a room implied money, and a few more nights implied more money than that, and she had no way of making more money appear once the $4 were gone. But there was nothing to be gained by saying so to a stranger on a train platform, so she thanked him again, picked up her bag, and walked her children toward town with her spine straight and her face arranged into something that might pass, from a distance, for composure. Coldwater was not a large place. A main street with a scattering of false-fronted buildings, a mercantile, a saddlery, a church with a steeple that looked like it had been added as an afterthought, a saloon with a piano audible even at this hour, and at the far end, the boarding house, a two-story clapboard building with smoke curling thin and gray from its chimney. The wind cut down the street like it had business there and didn't care who it had to go through to get it done. People watched her pass. Not with curiosity, exactly. Curiosity would have been kinder. They watched her the way you watch weather you suspect is about to turn bad. A woman alone with 2 children, walking with the particular set of shoulders that said she had nowhere to be and no one waiting for her, was not a mystery in a town like this. It was a category, and the category had a name, even if nobody said it to her face that first afternoon: trouble. Mrs. Pruitt, when Clara found her, was a broad, sharp-eyed woman who took in the situation in roughly 4 seconds flat and arrived at a number. $2 a night, meals included, and I'll want it up front. I can pay for 2 nights, Clara said. I'll need to find work after that. Work? Mrs. Pruitt said the word like she was testing it for rot. What kind of work were you figuring on with 2 little ones underfoot? Whatever there is. I can keep books. I can sew. I can cook. Coldwater's got a mercantile, and that's about it for hiring a woman, and Hank Doyle's wife already keeps his books. Mrs. Pruitt looked at her for a long moment, and something in her face shifted, not quite to sympathy, but to a kind of weary practicality. You're the mail-order bride. Sorrel Carter's girl. I was supposed to be his wife. Lord, Mrs. Pruitt shook her head. That man. Well, $2 a night, like I said. And I expect you'll want supper. The children look about ready to fall over. The room was small and the bed narrow, but it was warm. And that night Clara sat on the edge of it with Lily finally asleep against her and Evan curled at her side, not sleeping, watching her with the steady, 2 old eyes he'd had since his father died. Are we going home? He asked. We don't have a home to go to, sweetheart. Not anymore. Are we going to stay here? She thought about the $4, soon to be considerably less than $4, and the woman downstairs who'd as much as told her there was no work to be had, and the town that had looked at her on the walk over like she was a problem waiting to declare itself. I don't know, she said, because she had decided somewhere around the 8th day of the train ride that she would stop telling her son comfortable lies. He deserved better from her than that, even if the truth was harder to give him. But I promise you, I'm going to find something. I always do. It wasn't entirely true. She had never, in fact, been in a situation quite this dire before. But it was the kind of thing a mother said. And Evan, despite everything, despite the train and the empty platform and the cold, let himself lean into her and close his eyes. Potim. The 2 days bought by her dwindling money passed the way bad news always does. Too slowly while you're waiting for it, and far too fast once it's nearly out of time. Clara walked the length of Coldwater's one real street twice over, going into the mercantile and the saddlery and even the church, asking after work, and got the same answer everywhere in different shades of regret or indifference. Nothing for a woman, especially not one with 2 small children who couldn't be left alone all day. She was standing outside the mercantile on the second afternoon, Lily on her hip and Evan's hand in hers, doing the arithmetic of her situation for what felt like the 100th time. One more night at Mrs. Pruitt's, and after that the boarding house steps, or the church, or God knew what, the kind of charity that came with its own kind of cost. When a wagon pulled up at the hitching post a few yards down, and a man stepped down from it who didn't have the look of the rest of the town. He was tall, dark-haired, somewhere on the better side of 35, dressed plainly but well, in the manner of a man who had money and didn't feel the need to announce it. He had the kind of face that had seen hard weather and hadn't let it sour him entirely. There were lines at the corners of his eyes that looked more like the residue of thought than of bitterness. He was loading sacks of feed into the back of the wagon, and he glanced over once, twice, and then a third time, in the way of someone who has noticed something and is trying to decide whether it's his business. It was the third look that decided it. He set down the sack he was carrying and walked over, unhurried, the way a man walks when he isn't afraid of much. "You're the Carter woman," he said. Not a question. "I was supposed to be," Clara said, with the flat weariness of someone who'd had this exact exchange too many times in 2 days. Mr. Carter, it turns out, had other plans. I heard. Something in his expression, not pity, she'd had enough of pity to recognize it on sight and reject it. Something closer to a kind of careful respect. Caleb Westridge, he said, I've got a ranch about 6 miles out, west side of the valley. Clara Hayes. She didn't offer her hand. Her arms were full of daughter. These are my children, Evan and Lily. Caleb crouched down, briefly, to Evan's level. Not in the cooing, performative way some adults did with children, but the way you'd address someone you respected. You looked after your mother and your sister on that train ride? Evan, startled into something like pride, straightened. Yes, sir. Good man. Caleb stood again and turned his attention back to Clara, and there was nothing soft in his face now, only a kind of plain assessment. I don't make a habit of involving myself in other people's troubles, Mrs. Hayes, but I run a cattle operation, and my records are in a state I'm ashamed to admit to a stranger, and I understand you can read and write and keep figures. I can. I can't pay much, but there's a cottage on the property, sound roof, stove that works, and it'd be yours and your children's for as long as the work lasts. In exchange, you'd sort out my ledgers, my land filings, whatever paperwork I've let pile up since my foreman quit keeping it straight 2 years back. Clara looked at him for a long moment. She had not survived this long, through one husband's death and another's abandonment, and 11 days on a train with 2 frightened children, by trusting easily, and she did not intend to start now simply because a man with kind eyes had offered her a way out of an impossible situation. Why? She said. Why offer this to a stranger you found outside the mercantile? Caleb didn't flinch from the question, which she counted in some private ledger of her own as a point in his favor. Because I spent some years doing investigative work before I came into this ranch. Insurance claims mostly, fraud cases, that kind of thing. And I've got an eye for when someone's desperate and when someone's capable, and it's rare to find both in the same person standing in front of you needing help. And because, he added, more quietly, this town doesn't think much of you right now, Mrs. Hayes, and I've found that towns are often wrong about people they've decided not to like. That's not really an answer to why you'd take the risk. No, he agreed. It isn't. I suppose the honest answer is that I looked at your boy holding your hand like he was the one taking care of you instead of the other way around, and I thought about what kind of town lets a woman and 2 children go hungry over a man's broken promise, and I didn't like the answer, and I happened to be in a position to do something about it. That's all it is, no more complicated than that. Clara thought of the $4 that were now closer to 1. She thought of another night at Mrs. Pruitt's that she couldn't afford, and the church's brand of charity that came, she suspected, with questions she didn't want to answer. She thought of Evan's face on the train platform and Lily's small, cold hands. I'll need to see the cottage before I agree to anything, she said, and I'll want it understood plainly between us. I'm not coming to your ranch as anything but a bookkeeper, Mr. Westridge. Nothing else is on offer, and nothing else ought to be expected. If he was offended by the bluntness, he didn't show it. Understood plainly, he said. I'm not in the market for a wife, Mrs. Hayes, mail order or otherwise. I'm in the market for someone who can make sense of a stack of paper I've been avoiding for 2 years because every time I look at it, it makes my head hurt. If you can do that, we'll get along fine. But the cottage, when she saw it that same afternoon, was small but solid. 2 rooms, a stove that drew well, a roof that didn't show daylight through it anywhere Clara could find, and a window that looked out over a stretch of pasture running down toward a creek lined with cottonwoods, their bare branches silvered with the day's thin light. It was more than she had dared hope for 2 days prior, and she stood in the doorway with Lily asleep against her shoulder, and felt something in her chest loosen for the first time since the train pulled into cold water. It's not much, Caleb said, standing a respectful distance back. It's a great deal more than I had yesterday. She turned to look at him. I'll start tomorrow if that suits. It suits. The ranch house itself sat a quarter-mile up from the cottage, a sprawling, sturdy structure that had clearly been built by someone with more ambition than design sense, additions stacked onto additions over what looked like a couple of decades, and the room Caleb led her to the next morning, when she arrived with Evan trailing behind her and Lily deposited, with some trepidation on Clara's part, in the care of an elderly ranch hand's wife named Bess, who'd agreed to mind the children for a few hours a day, told her everything she needed to know about the scope of the problem she'd just agreed to solve. It wasn't disorder so much as accumulated neglect. Stacks of paper covered the desk and two of the chairs and a good portion of the floor. Receipts, letters, half-finished ledgers, land filings gone yellow at the edges, all of it piled without any system Clara could detect on first inspection. "My foreman, Whit Larson, used to keep all this," Caleb said, standing in the doorway with the particular discomfort of a man showing someone his worst habits. "When he left, I figured I'd get to it eventually. Eventually's been 2 years." "Why did Mr. Larson leave?" "Said he had family trouble back east. Packed up quick, didn't give much notice." Caleb shrugged, but there was something in the set of his shoulders that suggested the departure had bothered him more than he was letting on. "I didn't think much of it at the time. I had calving season on top of me and not much room to ask questions." Clara surveyed the room again, and something in her, the part of her that had, before her first marriage, kept books for a dry goods store in Ohio and had been, by her own quiet estimation, better at it than anyone who'd come before or since, began, almost against her will, to itch with purpose. "I'll need a week at least just to sort what's here into some kind of order," she said. "After that, I can tell you what you're actually looking at. Take whatever time you need." She started that morning, and by the end of the first week, she had the desk cleared and 3 stacks established: current accounts, correspondence, and land records, and a 4th smaller pile that she kept separate without entirely admitting to herself why. It was the land records that troubled her first. Not because anything was obviously wrong. Nothing jumped out and announced itself as fraud, nothing so simple as that, but because the documents didn't agree with each other in small, persistent ways that a careless reader would never have noticed and that a careful one couldn't quite ignore. A survey filed with the county in 1874 described the eastern boundary of Westridge land running along a line that didn't quite match the boundary described in a 1881 supplementary filing, the discrepancy amounting to perhaps 60 acres, no more. The kind of small drift that might be explained by sloppy surveying, except that sloppy surveying tended to drift in both directions over time, randomly. And this drift went only one way, away from Westridge land and toward whatever lay on the other side of that boundary. She didn't say anything to Caleb at first. She wasn't a surveyor, and she'd learned, over the course of one marriage and one catastrophic almost marriage, the cost of speaking too soon about things she didn't yet fully understand. "You've gone quiet," Caleb said, on the 9th day, coming into the office to find her staring at 2 documents laid side by side on the desk, her brow furrowed in a way that he was apparently coming to recognize. "I might be imagining something." "Imagining what?" She explained the discrepancy as best she could. The 60 acres, the direction of the drift, the fact that it appeared only in the eastern boundary, never the others. Caleb leaned over the desk and looked at the 2 surveys for a long moment, and something in his face went still in a way it hadn't been before. "That eastern boundary runs up against the old Drummond claim," he said slowly. "Drummond sold out 3 years back. Sold to a holding company out of Chicago, if I recall. Never thought much about it. It wasn't my land changing hands." What was the company called, Caleb thought? Whitmore Land and Cattle, I believe. Why? Clara didn't have an answer to that yet. Only the itch of a pattern not quite visible. The sense of a shape moving under still water. "I don't know," she said honestly, "but I'd like to find out if you'll let me keep looking." "I told you to take whatever time you need." He straightened, and there was something new in his expression when he looked at her now. Not quite alarm, but the wariness of a man who has just realized that the thing he hired someone to tidy might turn out to be considerably more dangerous than a messy desk. "Just be careful what you go digging at, Mrs. Hayes. Some ground's better left untouched if you don't know what's buried under it." "I generally find," Clara said, "that the ground that's most insistent on being left untouched is exactly the ground worth digging." Life at Westridge settled over the following weeks into a rhythm that surprised Clara with how much she'd missed having one. Mornings she walked Evan and Lily up to the main house, where Bess fed them and minded them with a gruff, genuine warmth that made something ache in Clara's chest every time she thought too hard about how long it had been since her children had anyone but her looking after them. Days she spent in the office, working through the accumulated paper, and slowly, methodically, the ranch's finances took shape under her hands. Debts identified and reckoned with, payments owed and payments due sorted into something a person could actually look at and understand. Evenings, she walked back down to the cottage with her children, made supper on the stove that drew well, and sat by the window some nights after they were asleep, looking out at the dark shape of the cottonwoods along the creek, and allowed herself, in small, careful doses, to feel something like safety. It didn't last in its simplest form, of course. Nothing that good ever did, not for Clara, not in her experience of the world. But before it broke, there were weeks of it, real and unhurried, and she held on to them the way you hold on to anything you suspect might not stay. Caleb, for his part, kept the distance he'd promised on that first afternoon outside the mercantile, and Clara found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, respecting him more for it rather than less. He didn't linger in the office without reason. He didn't make the kind of comments men sometimes made to widows they considered fair game. When he came to discuss the books, he discussed the books, and when Evan trailed after him one afternoon, fascinated by the horses, Caleb let the boy follow and showed him, with a patience that struck Clara as entirely unperformed, how to brush down a gelding without getting kicked. "You're good with him," she said one evening, watching from the porch as Caleb walked Evan back from the corral, the boy talking with an animation she hadn't seen in him since before his father died. "I had a younger brother once," Caleb said, and something closed briefly behind his eyes before he went on. "Died young. I suppose I never quite lost the habit of looking out for someone smaller than me. I'm sorry. It was a long time ago." He said it the way people say things they've decided, by force of will, to have made peace with, whether or not the peace is entirely real. "Your boy's a good listener. Most children that age, you tell them once how to do something and they're already off doing the opposite. He pays attention." "He's had to," Clara said more honestly than she meant to. "Paying attention is how he survived the last 2 years." Caleb looked at her for a long moment, and there was something in his face that wasn't pity. She would not have tolerated pity, and some instinct in him seemed to understand that. But something more like recognition, the look of one person who has weathered something hard seeing the same weather in someone else. "You've done well by them," he said. "Whatever else has happened to you, that much is plain to anyone with eyes." It was the kind of compliment that should have meant little, coming from a man she'd known only weeks, and yet Clara found it settling into her chest with more weight than she'd anticipated, and she had to look away toward the dark line of the mountains to keep her composure. The trouble announced itself properly on a morning in early November, when Clara arrived at the office to find one of the hands, a wiry, nervous young man named Tom Pruitt, no relation, as far as she could tell, to the boarding house Mrs. Pruitt, waiting outside with his hat in his hands and an expression that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. "Ma'am," he said, "is Mr. Westridge about?" "He's out at the north pasture. Is something wrong?" Tom hesitated long enough that Clara's stomach went tight before he managed it. "Fence lines down along the east boundary, the whole stretch by the old Drummond claim. Looks cut, not fallen, and there's survey stakes gone from where they ought to be. Somebody's pulled 'em up and moved 'em a good ways over." Clara felt the cold settle into her in a way that had nothing to do with the November air. "How far over?" "Hard to say exact, ma'am. But it's pushing the line further onto Westridge ground than it's got any business being, or further off it, depending which way you're looking at it from." She thought of the 60 acres. She thought of the slow drift that went only one direction, year over year, document over document, and she thought of Whitmore land and cattle, a name that had sat in the back of her mind for weeks now, like a splinter she hadn't yet worked loose. "Find Mr. Westridge," she said. "Tell him I need to speak with him as soon as he can come in. And Tom—" She stopped him as he turned to go. "Don't move the stakes back yourself. Don't touch the fence either, not till he's seen it as it is." Tom looked at her with new respect, the look of a man realizing the bookkeeper might know more about what was happening on this ranch than he did. "Yes, ma'am." When Caleb came in an hour later, dust on his coat and his face set in the particular hardness of a man who has just seen something he didn't want to see, Clara was waiting with the survey documents already laid out on the desk, the 1874 filing beside the 1881 supplementary, the discrepancy she'd flagged weeks earlier now sitting between them like an accusation finally given room to speak. "Tell me what you found," he said. "Cut fence and moved stakes, same as Tom told you, I'd wager. But it's not random vandalism, Caleb. Look here." She traced the line on the older survey with her finger, then the newer one. "This drift has been happening on paper for years before anyone touched a stake in the ground. Someone's been adjusting the official record slowly enough that nobody would notice, and now they're moving to make the ground match the paper. That's not theft. That's the last step of something that's been in motion a long time. Caleb was quiet for a moment, studying the documents. And when he looked up, his face had the focus of the investigator he used to be, not the rancher he'd become. You think this traces back to Whitmore? I think it's worth finding out before the county records office finishes whatever's been done to them. Paper trails don't stay buried forever, Caleb, but they don't stay clean forever either, not if someone's actively working on them. If there's a filing somewhere that proves what's really happened to that boundary, we need it before it disappears too. And if there isn't, then we'll need every scrap we can find here to prove what's been altered, because the absence of a record is its own kind of evidence, if you know how to read it. Caleb looked at her for a long moment, not with doubt, she realized, but with something closer to the dawning recognition of having underestimated, in the most fortunate way possible, exactly who he'd hired off a mercantile sidewalk 2 months prior. "All right, Mrs. Hayes," he said, "tell me what you need." "I need to go to Helena," she said. "The county filings are one thing, but state survey records are kept separate. And if anyone's been tampering with local copies, the state's master record might still be clean. I need to see the original 1874 survey, the one filed with the territorial office, not the copy that's been sitting in a county drawer where anybody with the right kind of access could have gotten at it. That's 3 days' travel, there and back in this weather, with 2 children to think of. Bess will mind them. She's offered before, and I trust her with them more than I'd trust most." Clara straightened, and there was a set to her jaw now that hadn't been there when she stepped off the train 2 months earlier, the set of a woman who had stopped merely surviving the ground under her feet and started, instead, to fight for it. "Caleb, somebody cut your fence and moved your stakes because they believe the paper underneath it already says the ground is theirs, or near enough that nobody will bother arguing. They're wrong. But proving they're wrong means getting ahead of them, not waiting to see what they do next." Caleb studied her for a moment longer, and then he nodded, once, the decision settling into him visibly. "Then we go to Helena, both of us. I'm not sending you alone into the middle of whatever this turns out to be. I wasn't going to ask you to. I know." Something almost like a smile touched the corner of his mouth, brief and tired, but real. "That's rather the point, Mrs. Hayes. You wouldn't have asked. You'd have just gone." Outside, the wind had picked up, dragging low gray clouds across the tops of the mountains, and somewhere out past the cottonwoods a fence lay cut and a boundary stood moved, waiting for whoever came next to decide what kind of ground this was really going to be, stolen or defended. Clara folded the surveys carefully back into their worn paper sleeves and felt, beneath the cold dread of what was coming, something else stirring that she had not expected to find in herself again after the train platform and the empty promise and the long gray weeks of not knowing where her children would sleep next month. It felt, unmistakably, like purpose. And for the first time since Sorrel Carter's name had become a word she could no longer say without bitterness, Clara Hayes intended to use it. The road to Helena ran rough under a sky the color of dishwater, and Clara spent the first hour of the journey simply watching the land pass, letting the rhythm of the wagon wheels settle something in her chest that had been wound tight since Tom Pruitt had come to the office with his hat in his hands. "You're quiet," Caleb said, eyes on the road, the reins loose but ready in his hands. "I'm thinking about what we'll find, or won't find." Clara pulled her coat tighter against the wind. "There's a particular kind of fear that comes with chasing a thing you can't be certain exists yet. I keep telling myself I might be wrong about all of it. That the drift in those surveys is nothing more than a careless clerk's hand, 60 years of small mistakes compounding into something that only looks deliberate because I want it to look deliberate. And if you're wrong, then I've cost you 3 days and a great deal of worry over nothing, and I'll apologize for it plainly." Caleb glanced at her, something dry at the corner of his mouth. "You don't strike me as a woman prone to seeing conspiracies where there's only carelessness. I didn't used to be. But I've learned the last 2 years that the world is considerably less interested in being fair to a woman alone than I once assumed it would be, and a person adjusts their assumptions accordingly." She looked out at the gray sweep of the foothills. "I'd rather be wrong and foolish than right and unprepared." They stopped that night in a town called Three Forks, a collection of buildings clustered around a rail depot and took 2 rooms at a boarding house that smelled of wood smoke and boiled mutton. Clara lay awake longer than she meant to, listening to the wind work at the shutters, thinking of Evan and Lily back at the ranch with Bess, hoping the boy wasn't lying awake himself, wondering if his mother was coming back this time, the way the last man who was supposed to be there for him hadn't. They reached Helena on the afternoon of the second day, the territorial capital sprawling out below them in a haze of chimney smoke, more building and more bustle than Clara had seen since she'd left Ohio. And something in her chest tightened at the sight of it. Not fear, exactly, but the awareness of how much bigger this fight might turn out to be than a cut fence and a few moved stakes. The Territorial Survey Office occupied the ground floor of a square brick building 2 streets back from the main thoroughfare, and the clerk who greeted them, a thin young man named Avery with spectacles too big for his face, seemed entirely unprepared for the determination with which Clara approached his counter. "I need to see the original 1874 survey for the Westridge property, Eastern Boundary Section," she said. "Filed with the Territorial Office, not a county copy." "That's quite an old filing, ma'am. Might take some time to locate in the archive." "We have the time," Caleb said, setting a few coins on the counter with the easy authority of a man used to greasing the wheels of bureaucracy when necessary. "We'd be grateful if you could make it sooner rather than later." Avery disappeared into the back for the better part of an hour, and when he returned he carried a flat document case, its leather cracked with age, and laid it open on the counter with the particular care of a man who understood, even without knowing the details, that what he held mattered. Clara leaned over it, and there it was, the original 1874 survey, the boundary line drawn in faded ink exactly where she'd suspected it ought to be. 60 acres further east than the line, described in the supplementary 1881 filing that sat in the county records back in Coldwater. "This is it," she said, quiet, almost to herself. "This is the boundary before anyone touched it." "Touched it how, ma'am?" Avery asked, curiosity overtaking his professional reserve. "That," Caleb said, "is what we're here to find out. Is there any record of who requested the 1881 supplementary filing? Any authorization attached to it?" Avery disappeared again, longer this time, and came back looking faintly troubled. "There's a notation here, sir. The supplementary filing was authorized under a dual signature, county surveyor and a representative of an interested party, on account of an adjacent claim dispute. The representative's name is listed as G. Whitmore." Clara felt the room tilt very slightly, the way it does when a suspicion you've half-talked yourself out of turns all at once, into a fact. "Gideon Whitmore," she said. "Personally." "That's the name recorded, ma'am, yes." Caleb's jaw had gone tight, the easy authority of moments before replaced by something harder. "So, he didn't just buy the Drummond claim and let his lawyers handle the paperwork. He put his own name on the filing that moved my boundary line 60 acres in his favor." "It would seem that way, sir." "Could we get a certified copy of this?" Clara asked. "Both the original and the supplementary filing, with the authorization notation included?" "I can have that prepared by morning, ma'am. There's a fee for certification, but it's not unreasonable." "We'll pay it," Caleb said, before Clara could even reach for the small reserve of money she'd brought with her. "Whatever it costs." That night, in the boarding house, Clara sat across a small table from Caleb with the day's revelation between them like a living thing, and for a while neither of them spoke. "This is bigger than a dispute over 60 acres, Caleb said finally. "A man like Whitmore doesn't put his own name on a filing for 60 acres of pasture unless that 60 acres is the smallest piece of something considerably larger. I agree. I think this is one boundary out of several he's adjusted, on paper, over a number of years, and Westridge Ranch is simply the most recent one he's decided to finish collecting." Clara folded her hands on the table, steadying herself. "Caleb, I think we need to know what else Whitmore Land and Cattle has acquired in this territory over the last decade. If there's a pattern, it won't only be your land at stake. There may be other ranchers in the same position you're in who don't have anyone looking closely enough at their paperwork to notice. You think this is bigger than Westridge? I think it's worth finding out before we assume it isn't." Caleb sat back, and for a long moment, he looked at her the way he had outside the mercantile that first afternoon, assessing, careful, but without any of the wariness. "When I hired you, Mrs. Hayes, I thought I was getting someone to make sense of my ledgers. You were. I got a good deal more than that. I'd remind you," Clara said, with the faintest tired curve of a smile, That I warned you the ground most insistent on being left alone is usually the ground worth digging into. You can hardly act surprised now that I've found something underneath it. They returned to Coldwater 4 days after they'd left, certified copies safely wrapped in oilcloth in Caleb's saddlebag. And the moment Clara stepped through the cottage door and Evan flung himself against her, words tumbling out about the calf Bess had let him help feed, and the way the wind had nearly knocked Lily off her feet in the yard, something in Clara settled that had been unsettled since the train platform. They were safe. For now, at least, they were safe. And she intended to keep it that way by whatever means the paper in Caleb's saddlebag would allow. But the ranch they'd returned to was not quite the ranch they'd left. "There's been a man asking after you," Bess told her that first evening, lowering her voice, though the children were occupied with supper at the other end of the table. "Came by twice while you were gone. Said he was a lawyer, representing some land company out of Chicago, wanting to discuss what did he call it? A boundary discrepancy, friendly-like, before things got complicated." "Did he leave a name?" "Harlan Reese, I believe he said. Left a card for Mr. Westridge." Caleb's expression, when Clara relayed this to him the next morning, had the stillness of a man receiving news he'd half expected, but hoped to avoid. "Reese," he said, "I know the name. He's handled disputed claims for outside investors before, has a reputation for offering a quiet settlement before things go to court, and for making the alternative sound considerably worse than it usually turns out to be. You think he means to frighten you into giving up the land before anyone looks too closely at how Whitmore came to claim it in the first place?" "I think that's exactly what he means to do." Caleb's mouth tightened. "And I think the fact that he showed up the moment we left for Helena, rather than weeks ago when the fence was first cut, tells us something. Somebody's watching this ranch closely enough to know when its owner leaves the territory." The thought settled cold in Clara's stomach. "Whit Larson," she said slowly. "Your old foreman. What about him?" "You said he left suddenly 2 years ago, right around the time, if the dates on these filings are anything to go by, that someone began adjusting your boundary records. A man who kept your books and your land filings would have been in a position to know exactly which documents to misplace, which to leave incomplete, which discrepancies to simply never mention to you." Caleb was quiet for a long moment, turning this over. "You think Larson was paid to leave the books in disorder? Paid by Whitmore to make the ranch easier to take once the time came?" "I think it would explain a great deal that's puzzled me since I first sat down at that desk. 2 years of neglected paperwork is one thing. 2 years of paperwork neglected in exactly the ways that would hide a slow theft of land. That's something else entirely. There's no way to prove that without finding Larson." "Then we find him," Claire said, with a steadiness that surprised even her. "Or we find some trace of payment, some record connecting him to Whitmore, the same way we found the connection between Whitmore and the supplementary filing. Caleb, men like this don't move money around without leaving some mark of it somewhere. They're too careful with land and too careless with paper, because they've never had anyone look closely enough to catch them at it before." "You sound like you relish the prospect." "I don't relish any of it," Claire said, more sharply than she intended, and then softer, "but I've spent 2 years being the person things happened to. My husband died, and I had no say in it. Sorrel Carter abandoned me, and I had no say in that either. I find I have very little patience left for standing by while someone decides, from 100 miles away, what's to become of the only stability my children have left. If there's a way to stop it, I intend to find it, and I intend to be the one who finds it." Caleb studied her for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his eyes, and then he nodded, slow and certain. "Then we'll find it together. But Clara," it was the first time he'd used her given name, and she noticed it the way you notice a change in weather. "If Reese comes back, let me speak to him. A lawyer like that, sent by a man like Whitmore, isn't going to take kindly to being told no by a woman, however much smarter than him she happens to be. I'd rather he underestimate me than discover too quickly what we already know." "That sounds remarkably like you asking me to step back. It sounds like me asking you to let him think he's still ahead of us, for a little while longer. There's a difference." Clara considered this, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she trusted the distinction. "All right," she said, "but I want to be in the room. I want to hear whatever he says with my own ears, not relayed secondhand. I wouldn't have it any other way." Harlan Reese arrived 3 days later, driving a hired buggy up the long approach to the ranch house with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never once, in his professional life, doubted the outcome of a negotiation before it began. He was younger than Clara expected, smooth-faced, well-dressed in a way that looked faintly absurd against the backdrop of frost-hardened pasture, and he greeted Caleb with a handshake and a smile that didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. "Mr. Westridge, a pleasure. I understand you've had some trouble out along your eastern boundary." "I understand you'd know more about the cause of that trouble than I do," Caleb said, showing him into the office without any particular warmth. Reese's smile didn't waver. "I represent Whitmore Land and Cattle, who hold the adjacent Drummond claim. My client has become aware of a discrepancy in the historical boundary records between the two properties, and rather than allow the matter to descend into costly litigation, he's authorized me to offer a settlement, a fair price for the disputed acreage, paid promptly, with no need for either party to involve the courts or stir up unpleasantness in the community." "How generous," Caleb said. "My client values neighborly relations, Mr. Westridge." Clara, seated to one side with a ledger open on her lap as though she were merely there to take notes, watched Reese's face as he spoke, and found herself cataloging the small tells of a man rehearsing a script he'd delivered many times before. The slight pause before neighborly, the practiced ease with which he produced a folded document from his coat and set it on the desk. "The settlement figure," he said, "along with a release form transferring clear title to the disputed acreage. My client is prepared to be quite generous given the circumstances." Caleb didn't reach for the document. "What circumstances would those be, Mr. Reese?" "Simply that boundary disputes of this nature can drag on for years in territorial court, at considerable expense to both parties, with no guarantee of outcome for either. My client would prefer a swift resolution. I'd think, given the size of your operation against the resources of a company like Whitmore Land and Cattle, you might prefer that too." It was, Clara thought, a threat dressed so carefully in the language of reasonableness that a less attentive listener might have missed it entirely. The bald suggestion that Caleb couldn't afford to fight this in court, regardless of who was right. "I appreciate the offer," Caleb said, with a courtesy that Clara could tell cost him some effort. "I'll need time to consider it properly. A matter of land is not one I'd want to settle in haste." Reese's smile thinned almost imperceptibly. "Of course, though I'd encourage you not to take too much time, Mr. Westridge. These things have a way of becoming more complicated the longer they sit unresolved. Fences get cut by parties unknown. Stakes get moved by hands nobody can identify. It would be a shame for matters to grow more unpleasant than they need to be when a simple signature could put it all to rest." "Is that a threat, Mr. Reese?" Clara asked, unable finally to keep silent, her voice even and cool despite the heat rising in her chest. Reese turned to her as though noticing her presence for the first time, and something in his gaze flicked over her, the dismissive once-over of a man deciding a woman wasn't worth addressing directly. "I'm simply observing, ma'am, that unresolved disputes have a way of generating their own troubles. I'm sure Mr. Westridge understands my meaning." "Mr. Westridge understands a great many things," Clara said, holding his gaze without flinching, "including the fact that a supplementary survey filed in 1881 bears your client's personal signature as an interested party, authorizing a boundary adjustment that conveniently shifted 60 acres of Westridge land onto the Drummond claim, years before your client found it necessary to send you here with this generous offer." For just a moment, half a second, no more, something flickered behind Reese's composure, a recalculation happening rapidly behind his eyes. "I'm not familiar with the specific filing you're describing, ma'am." "I'd encourage you to become familiar with it," Clara said, "before your client asks you to put anything else in writing on his behalf." Reese gathered the unsigned settlement document from the desk with hands that were, Clara noted with some satisfaction, not quite as steady as they had been a minute before. "I'll relay your position to my client. I expect he'll want to discuss this further." "I expect he will," Caleb said, standing to see him out, his tone pleasant and his eyes anything but. "Tell him we look forward to it." When the buggy had disappeared down the long drive, Caleb turned to Clara with an expression caught somewhere between alarm and admiration. "You weren't planning to tell me you intended to say all that." "I wasn't planning to say it until he threatened you outright and dressed it up as neighborly concern. I find I have limited tolerance for that particular brand of dishonesty." "Remind me never to underestimate you in a negotiation, Mrs. Hayes,"
I'd rather you simply remember it the first time, Clara said, and save us both the trouble of you learning it twice. But the brief satisfaction of the exchange didn't last long into the evening. Caleb found her in the office after supper, a fresh worry etched into his face that hadn't been there when Reese's buggy pulled away.
Tom found something out by the creek this afternoon, he said. A stretch of fence further down near the cottonwoods. Not just cut this time. Burned. Whoever did it wanted to make sure it couldn't simply be repaired. Clara felt the cold settle back into her chest, the brief warmth of the day's small victory burning off fast. They're escalating. They're trying to frighten us into accepting that settlement before we have time to build a case against them properly. Caleb sat heavily in the chair across from her desk. Clara, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. The cottage is close to that creek line. If this continues, if whoever's doing this decides cutting fences isn't enough to make their point,
I'm not leaving, Clara said before he could finish the thought. If that's what you're working your way toward asking, the answer is no. I'm asking because your children are out there with you, and I have no way of guaranteeing what kind of people Whitmore's willing to send next. My children have already lost a father to fever and very nearly lost everything else to a man's broken promise on a train platform, Clara said, her voice low and entirely steady. I'm not packing them up and running from this, Caleb, because running is what I've already done, and it's brought me nothing but more reasons to run again. I'd rather stand here and fight for solid ground than keep moving toward some place that might turn out to be just as unstable as the last. Caleb looked at her for a long moment, and there was something in his face. Not argument, she realized, but a kind of reluctant, weary respect for a decision he didn't love but understood completely. Then we'd better make sure the ground's worth standing on, he said. I'll have Tom and the other hands keep closer watch on the boundary at night. And Clara, I want you to start putting everything we have into a single, clear account. Every discrepancy, every filing, every connection between Larson's disappearance and Whitmore's name on that supplementary survey. If Reese comes back with lawyers instead of settlement offers, I want to be holding something a federal court can't ignore. Not just a collection of suspicions a clever attorney can pick apart one piece at a time. I've already started, Clara said, and pulled open the drawer where, for the past several days, she had been quietly building exactly that. Outside, the wind moved cold and steady across the pasture, carrying with it the faint, acrid memory of burned wood from the creek line, and somewhere out past the dark shapes of the cottonwoods, a fight that had begun as a question of 60 acres was settling, fence post by fence post, into something neither Clara nor Caleb could any longer pretend was small. The drawer Clara had shown Caleb that night held more than he'd expected. She had been building the case quietly for weeks, long before the burned fence or Reese's visit, organizing each discrepancy into a sequence that moved from small irregularity to deliberate pattern with the steady, patient logic of someone who understood that evidence didn't announce itself in a single dramatic discovery, but accumulated piece by piece until the weight of it became impossible for a reasonable person to dismiss. Over the next several days, she laid it out for him across the office desk, document by document, until the surface of the wood disappeared entirely under a careful arrangement of papers she'd sorted into what she called her chain, each link connecting to the next, each small deception pointing toward the larger one it served. Start here, she said, on a morning when the November wind was throwing sleet against the office windows, and the stove wasn't quite keeping up. She placed the 1874 survey flat on the desk. This is the original. The eastern boundary runs here. Her finger traced the line. Now look at this. She placed the 1881 supplementary beside it. Same boundary, different line, 60 acres of difference, and Whitmore's signature authorizing the change. That's the first link. That much I follow. Good. Now here's where it starts to matter. She pulled a thin stack of receipts from the drawer, yellowed and dog-eared, and set them between the two surveys. These were buried in the bottom of a box of old correspondence that I found shoved behind the filing cabinet. They're payment stubs, small amounts, $30 here, $45 there, spread over a period of about 14 months, all made out to a man identified only by initials, W.L. Caleb's face went still. Whit Larson. The initials match, and the timing matches too. The payments begin approximately 6 months before Larson left the ranch, and they continue for 8 months after he was supposedly gone east to deal with family trouble.
which means either someone was paying a man who'd already left the territory for work he was no longer doing, or Larson didn't leave at all, not right away, and whatever he was being paid for didn't end when his employment here did. Where were the payments coming from? That's the third link. Clara pulled out a sheet of paper on which she'd copied, in her careful handwriting, a series of account numbers and transaction notations. The stubs don't name the payer directly, but they reference a banking house in Butte, Consolidated Territorial Trust. I've seen that name before, in a different context entirely. She reached for another document. This is a deed transfer for the old Drummond claim, the one adjacent to your eastern boundary. The purchasing entity is Whitmore Land and Cattle, but the financial institution handling the transaction is the same Consolidated Territorial Trust in Butte, the same bank that issued the payment stubs to WL. Caleb leaned back in his chair, and Clara watched him absorb it. The slow, uncomfortable recognition of a man who had lived beside a quiet theft for years without seeing it. So Whitmore was paying Larson through the same bank he used to buy the Drummond land, he said. Through the same bank, during the same period, in amounts too small to attract attention individually, but too consistent to be coincidental. Caleb, this isn't a boundary dispute between neighbors. This is a coordinated operation. Whitmore adjusted your boundary on paper, paid someone inside your own ranch to make sure the paperwork stayed disordered long enough for the adjustment to go unchallenged. And then, once the paper said what he needed it to say, he sent a lawyer to buy your silence before anyone noticed. But sight was a sheet. And the fence cutting, the burned posts, pressure. To make you feel vulnerable enough to take the settlement and stop asking questions. It's a pattern I suspect he's used before, on other properties, in other counties. You keep saying that it's not just Westridge. Clara hesitated, and Caleb saw it, the brief flicker of uncertainty that crossed her face before she steadied herself. I don't have proof of that yet, she admitted, but the infrastructure is too elaborate for one ranch. You don't establish a relationship with a bank in Butte and plant a paid man inside a single cattle operation unless you're building something that extends beyond one property line. The question is how many other ranchers have had their boundaries adjusted and their records sabotaged without ever knowing it happened. And how do we find that out? We go back to the records, Clara said. Not in Helena this time, in the county office here. If Whitmore's been adjusting boundaries across the territory, the county filings are where the evidence will be. Because the county office is where a man with the right connections could alter records most easily. Local clerks, local pressure, local oversight that doesn't look too hard at who's signing what. It took her the better part of 2 weeks, during which the weather turned hard and the days contracted to a few hours of gray light between long stretches of dark, and the children grew restless in the cottage, and Bess reported that Lily had taken a cough that wouldn't quite leave, and Evan had started asking with increasing frequency whether the bad men were going to come back. Clara heard the question secondhand from Bess and felt it land in her chest like a stone. He heard the hands talking about the fence, Bess said, apologetic. I tried to keep him away from it, but the boy hears things. That evening, Clara sat on the edge of Evan's bed in the cottage and held his hand and told him the truth, or as much of it as a 5-year-old could carry without breaking under the weight. There are some people who want to take land that doesn't belong to them, she said. And Mr. Westridge and I are working to stop them. That's why there's been trouble at the fence, and that's why some of the men have been worried. But nobody is going to hurt you, and nobody is going to hurt your sister. How do you know? Evan asked, and the smallness of his voice, the naked fear in it, made something in Clara's throat close up. Because I'm not going to let them, she said, and meant it with every part of herself that was still capable of meaning anything. Mama. He was quiet for a moment. Mr. Westridge said I could help him with the horses again tomorrow. Can I? You can. He's not going to leave, is he? Like the other man? Clara understood, with a clarity that cut, that by the other man her son did not mean his dead father. He meant Sorrel Carter, the man who had promised them a life, and then disappeared. The man whose absence had been, for Evan, not a death but something almost worse, a choice. Someone had chosen not to be there, and the boy, at 5, was already bracing for it to happen again. I don't think so, Clara said carefully, because she would not lie to him, not even to comfort him. Mr. Westridge is a man who keeps his promises, from what I've seen, but I can't know everything about the future, sweetheart.
What I can tell you is that right now, today, we are safe here, and I'm going to keep working very hard to make sure that stays true.
It was not enough. She knew it was not enough. But Evan nodded and curled onto his side and let her pull the blanket up, and she sat with him until his breathing slowed and evened, and then she went to the window and stood looking out at the dark for a long time, feeling the ache of a mother who understands that the damage done to her children is not the kind that can be undone by good intentions alone, but only by the slow, imperfect accumulation of days in which nothing terrible happens. The county records office in Coldwater was a small, dusty room at the back of the courthouse, staffed by a clerk named Harwood, who had held the position for 18 years and regarded any request for old files with the deep personal suspicion of a man who believed his archives existed primarily to be left alone. "I need to see boundary filings for properties adjacent to Westridge Ranch," Clara said, on the first of what would turn out to be several visits. "Everything from 1875 forward." "That's a considerable amount of paper, ma'am." "I'm aware of that." Harwood looked at her over the rims of his spectacles, clearly deciding whether to resist or cooperate, and apparently concluding that the woman standing in front of him was not going to be deterred by inconvenience. "I'll pull what I can," he said, "but it'll take time, and I'll thank you not to rearrange anything. These files have a system." "I'm sure they do," Clara said, with a politeness that cost her more effort than it should have, given that the system, as far as she could determine from the first hour of work, consisted primarily of putting things in piles and hoping nobody asked about them. She spent 3 days in Harwood's archive, and what she found confirmed every suspicion she hadn't wanted to be right about. Across 7 properties adjacent to or near the Westridge claim, she identified the same pattern: supplementary filings submitted between 1878 and 1883, each adjusting a boundary line by a modest amount, 40 acres here, 70 there, each authorized by a combination of the county surveyor and an interested party, and in 4 of the 7 cases, the interested party's name was either G. Whitmore directly or an agent of Whitmore Land and Cattle. In 3 of the 7 cases, the original property owners had already sold, to Whitmore, at prices that Clara, cross-referencing against the county tax assessments, calculated were well below market value. Sold, in other words, by ranchers who didn't know their boundaries had been quietly redrawn, who thought they were selling 50 or 100 acres less than they actually owned, who had no idea that the man buying their land had spent years, on paper, stealing pieces of it first. "This is 7 properties," she told Caleb that evening, spreading her notes across the office desk, while the wind threw itself against the walls of the ranch house. 7 that I found in one county. If the pattern holds across adjacent counties, and I believe it does, this could be dozens of families who've lost land without ever knowing it was taken. Caleb stood at the window looking out at the dark with his hands in his pockets, and when he turned back to her, there was something in his face she hadn't seen before, a kind of cold, focused anger that was nothing like the hot temper of a man who'd been personally wronged. This was the face of the investigator he used to be, the man who had made a career of following fraud to its source. "We need to be careful about how we take this forward," he said. "If we go public with what we have now, suspicions, patterns, circumstantial connections, Whitmore's lawyers will eat it alive. Reese isn't the only man on his payroll, and a company with that kind of money can afford to make a boundary dispute last longer than either of us can." "I know that. But if we bring it to the federal territorial office, if we can make the case that this isn't a local boundary dispute but a multi-county conspiracy involving falsified government records, that changes the jurisdiction. That takes it out of the hands of county courts where Whitmore might have influence and puts it somewhere his money can't reach as easily." "That's exactly what I was going to say," Clara said, with a ghost of a smile that didn't have much humor in it. "But we need one more piece. We need to connect the payments to Larson directly to Whitmore, not just to the same bank. As long as it's only the bank, a good lawyer can argue coincidence. We need someone who can testify to the arrangement, either Larson himself or someone who worked alongside him and saw the money change hands. Larson's gone. Idaho, Oregon, wherever the wind blew him. Then we need someone who hasn't gone yet." Caleb went quiet, thinking, and Clara could see the gears turning behind his eyes. The slow, methodical process of a man working backward through memory, reassessing years of ranch life in light of what he now knew. "There was a hand who worked here when Larson was foreman," he said slowly. "Name of Duff McGill. Older fellow, quiet,
Not the kind to involve himself in trouble, but not the kind to miss it either. He left about a year after Larson did, said he was tired of ranch work, wanted to try his luck at prospecting. I didn't think anything of it at the time. Do you know where he went? Last I heard, he was working a claim up near Garnet. Small camp, barely a town. If he's still there, it's maybe a day-and-a-half ride, depending on the weather. Then someone needs to go find him. I'll go, Caleb said. You've been carrying the weight of this investigation since the day you sat down at that desk, Clara. Let me carry some of it for a while. She wanted to argue. The instinct to argue was strong. The need to be the one who followed every thread to its end because trusting someone else to do it meant letting go of control she wasn't sure she could afford to release. But she looked at Caleb's face, the steadiness of it, the quiet determination, and she recognized something she had not allowed herself to recognize before, that this man, whatever else he was or wasn't, was someone she could rely on. Not because he'd promised to be reliable, but because he'd demonstrated it day after day, in the small, unremarkable ways that actually mattered. All right, she said, but take Tom with you. If Whitmore has people watching this ranch, I'd rather you weren't alone on the road. And you'll be here alone with the children. I won't be alone. Bess is here, and the other hands know the situation. And I have work to do. I want to finish mapping out every property I can find that Whitmore has touched. By the time you get back, whether you find McGill or not, I want a document so thorough that a federal investigator could walk into this office and understand the entire scheme in an hour. Caleb looked at her and something moved in his expression. Not quite tenderness, not quite admiration, but something adjacent to both, something he was clearly deciding not to name. When I found you standing outside the mercantile, he said, I thought I was doing you a kindness. You were. No, I was doing myself one. I just didn't know it yet. He left at first light, with Tom Pruitt riding alongside him, and Clara watched them go from the office window, the two figures growing small against the vast gray plain, and then she turned back to the desk and the work, because the work was the one thing she could control, and controlling it was the only way she knew to keep the fear at bay. The days without Caleb were the hardest since she'd arrived. Not because anything happened. The fence stayed intact, no strangers appeared on the road, and the ranch operated with the steady, uncomplaining rhythm of a place that had been running long enough to run itself. But because the absence of trouble was, in its own way, harder to bear than the presence of it. Trouble at least gave you something to respond to. Silence only gave you time to think about what might be coming next. Clara worked. She worked with a focus that bordered on obsession, spending hours in the office each day and carrying papers back to the cottage at night, building her document, which she had taken to calling, in the privacy of her own mind, the case, not a legal brief exactly, because she was not a lawyer and did not pretend to be, but a narrative of evidence so carefully assembled that a lawyer, or a judge, or a federal investigator could follow its logic from first suspicion to final proof without once losing the thread. She organized it chronologically. The 1874 original survey, the 1878 through 1883 supplementary filings, each with its boundary adjustment, each with its authorization signature, the Drummond sale in 1880, the formation of Whitmore Land and Cattle as a registered territorial entity in 1877, predating all the boundary adjustments, establishing the legal structure through which the acquisitions would be made, the payment stubs to WL, the banking connection through Consolidated Territorial Trust. The pattern of below-market purchases from ranchers who didn't know their land had been quietly shrunk on paper before the offer arrived. It was when she stood back and looked at it, a damning thing. Not perfect. She was painfully aware of the gaps, the places where suspicion hadn't yet hardened into proof, but substantial enough that no honest person could look at it and conclude that what had happened was accidental. On the third evening, without Caleb, she was sitting in the cottage after putting the children to bed, going over her notes by lamplight, when she heard hoofbeats on the road and went to the window with her heart suddenly hammering, because hoofbeats at this hour could mean Caleb returning or could mean something else entirely. It was neither. It was Bess's husband, old Frank, riding back from town with a face that told Clara something had happened before he said a word. There's been talk, he said, standing in the doorway of the cottage with his hat dripping from the sleet. In town, that lawyer, Reese, he's been making visits. Not just here. He's been at the Henshaw place and the Murdoch spread,
And old Bill Carver's up on the bench. Same offer each time from what I hear. Settle the boundary, take the money, don't ask questions. Has anyone taken it? Bill Carver's thinking on it. He's 70 years old, Mrs. Hayes, and he's got nobody to leave the place to. And the money Reese is talking isn't nothing. I think he's tired enough to say yes just to have it over with. Clara felt the familiar cold tighten in her chest. Every property that settled quietly was a piece of evidence lost, a thread cut before she could weave it into the larger pattern. Frank, do you know Bill Carver well enough to ask him to wait? Not to refuse, just to wait a few more days until Mr. Westridge gets back and we can show him what we found? Frank considered this with the slow deliberation of a man who'd spent his whole life in ranch country and understood both the value of patience and the cost of interfering in another man's business. I can try, he said. But you should know, ma'am, there's folks in town who aren't kindly disposed toward you and Mr. Westridge stirring things up. There's them that think a quiet settlement is better than a fight, even if the settlement isn't fair, because a fight brings uncertainty. And uncertainty is the one thing a rancher can't afford. I understand that, Clara said, but they're being robbed, Frank, whether they settle or fight. The only difference is whether they know it when it happens. I'll talk to Bill, Frank said. No promises. Caleb returned on the 5th day, riding in with Tom in the late afternoon, and Clara knew from the set of his shoulders, even at a distance, that he'd found something.
McGill's alive, he said, swinging down from the saddle with the stiffness of a man who'd spent too many hours in it. Still at Garnet, working a claim that isn't producing much. He's willing to talk, Clara, but he's frightened. When I told him what we'd found, he went white as paper and didn't speak for a full minute. What did he say when he did speak? He said Larson was paid. He saw it himself. Not the money changing hands directly, but the letters. Larson received letters from Butte, from what McGill described as a banking house, and after each letter, Larson would go into the office and spend hours with the land records, moving things around, pulling filings, replacing them with versions that didn't quite match. McGill thought it was strange but didn't want trouble. Larson was his boss, and a man doesn't question his boss's paperwork habits unless he wants to find himself out of work. Will he testify to that? In writing or before a federal official? Caleb hesitated. He's scared, Clara. He said something that bothered me. He said Larson warned him, before Larson left, that what they were doing was backed by people with long arms and short tempers, and that the smart thing was to forget what he'd seen and get out. That's why McGill left the ranch, not because he was tired of ranching, because he was afraid. But he hasn't forgotten. No, he hasn't forgotten. And I think, given the right assurances, that he'd be protected, that his testimony would go to federal officials rather than county ones where Whitmore might have influence. I think he'd come forward. But we'd need to get those assurances from someone with the authority to make them. Clara nodded slowly, the pieces arranging themselves in her mind with the clarity that came, she'd learned, not from brilliance, but from weeks of patient, grinding work. Then that's our next step. We take what we have, all of it, the surveys, the payment stubs, the banking connection, the pattern across 7 properties, and McGill's testimony, and we bring it to the federal territorial office. Not the county, not the local courts. Federal. That's a big step. It's the only step that matters now. Everything else is just waiting for Whitmore to make his next move, and every day we wait, Reese is out there convincing another rancher to sign away land they don't know has already been stolen. They sat together in the office that night, long after the hands had gone to their bunks and the ranch house had settled into its creaking quiet, and Clara walked Caleb through the complete document she'd built in his absence. Every link in the chain, every connection mapped and annotated, every gap honestly acknowledged alongside the evidence that surrounded it. When she finished, Caleb was quiet for a long time. "This is extraordinary work," he said. "It's bookkeeping," Clara said, with a sharpness she didn't entirely mean. "It's the same thing I did for a dry goods store in Ohio, except the numbers are bigger and the stakes are worse. Don't make it something it isn't. I'm not making it anything. I'm telling you what's in front of me, a woman who stepped off a train 2 months ago with nothing, who was abandoned by a man who wasn't worth the paper his letters were written on, who took a job organizing a stranger's desk and uncovered a fraud operation that stretches across multiple counties and involves one of the most powerful investors in the territory. That's not just bookkeeping, Clara, and you do yourself a disservice pretending otherwise." She wanted to argue with him. The instinct was reflexive, the product of years spent learning that the safest response to a compliment was to deflect it before it became something she depended on. But she was tired, genuinely tired, in the bone-deep way that comes not from physical labor, but from the sustained effort of holding together a situation that keeps trying to fall apart, and instead of arguing, she just nodded. "Thank you," she said. "I don't think I've heard that from anyone in a long time." "Then the people around you haven't been paying attention."
Something passed between them in the silence that followed. Not a declaration, nothing so dramatic or so simple, but an acknowledgement, mutual and unspoken, that whatever this was between them had moved somewhere in the accumulation of shared work and shared danger and shared evenings in this office, beyond the clean, professional arrangement they'd agreed to outside the mercantile. Where it had moved to, neither of them was ready to name, and there was wisdom in that reluctance. The wisdom of two people who had both been badly served by premature certainty. "We should sleep," Clara said. "If we're going to Helena again, we'll want to leave day after tomorrow at the latest." Agreed. Caleb stood and paused at the door. "Clara, for what it's worth, I think Evan's right about me." She looked at him, not understanding. "I'm not going to leave," he said. "Not from this ranch, and not from this fight. Whatever's coming, I intend to be here for it. I thought you should know that, plainly, so you don't have to wonder." He left before she could answer, which was, she suspected, deliberate. The kindness of a man who understood that some things landed better when they weren't immediately responded to. Clara walked back to the cottage through the cold and checked on Lily, whose cough was better, and on Evan, who slept with one hand flung out as if reaching for something. And she stood at the window of her small, warm, improbable home and looked out at the dark shapes of the cottonwoods and the mountains beyond them and the stars that appeared, now that the sleet had cleared, in hard bright points across a sky so wide it made the whole furious drama of boundary lines and stolen land and burned fences seem, for just a moment, very small. But it wasn't small. She knew that. It was the size of 17 families' lives, maybe more, and it was the size of her children's future. And it was the size of the question she'd been asking herself since she stepped off the train and found nobody waiting. Whether a woman alone with 2 small children and no money and no connections and nothing but her own stubborn, inconvenient refusal to accept what she'd been told was impossible could stand in the path of something enormous and make it change direction. She didn't know the answer yet, but she knew she was going to find out, and she knew she wasn't going to find out alone. And for now, for tonight, with her children breathing softly in their beds and the stove still warm and the stars impossibly bright over the dark Montana plain, that was enough to let her close her eyes and rest. They left for Helena 2 days later, as planned, but this time Clara brought the children with her. It was not a decision she made lightly. Leaving them with Bess again would have been simpler, certainly. Lily's cough had faded to a dry, intermittent thing that no longer kept her awake at night, and Evan had settled, in his cautious way, into the daily rhythm of the ranch enough that pulling him out of it felt like pulling a tooth that had only just stopped hurting. But the burned fence and Reese's veiled threats, and the knowledge that someone was watching the ranch closely enough to time their moves around Caleb's absences, had shifted something fundamental in Clara's calculation. She could not leave her children behind while she traveled into the middle of a fight she didn't yet know the full shape of, not because she doubted Bess's care, but because she had learned in 2 years of being the only wall between her children and the world's indifference, that the wall didn't work if it wasn't standing where they were. "You're sure about this?" Caleb asked, watching her bundle Lily into an extra layer of wool in the pre-dawn dark. "I'm sure I can't leave them here. Whether I'm sure about the rest of it is a different question." Fair enough. The journey was harder with the children. Lily fussed for the first hour, and then fell asleep against Clara's shoulder with the sudden total surrender of the very young, and Evan sat upright between them on the wagon seat, watching the landscape pass with his habitual gravity, asking occasional questions. How far was it? Were there bears in those mountains? What was Helena like? That Clara answered as best she could while keeping one hand on Lily to keep her from sliding, and the other hand, metaphorically, on the bundle of documents she'd wrapped in oilcloth and placed beneath the seat, the bundle that contained, as near as she could estimate, the compressed ruin of one of the most powerful men in the Montana Territory. They arrived in Helena on the evening of the second day, took rooms at the same boarding house as before, and Clara put the children to bed and then sat across the small table from Caleb, the lamplight throwing long shadows across his face, and said what she'd been thinking for the last 50 miles of bad road. "I want to be the one who presents the case." Caleb raised an eyebrow. "To the federal office. To whoever will listen. I built it. I know every piece of it, where it fits, what it proves, what the gaps are, and why they don't matter. If you present it, you'll be presenting someone else's work. And when they ask questions, and they will ask questions, you'll have to translate my answers into yours, and something will be lost in the translation. Clara, the Federal Territorial Office is not the kind of place that's accustomed to hearing a case presented by a woman."
I'm aware of that. They may not take you seriously. They may not, but they're considerably more likely to take the evidence seriously if it's presented by the person who found it and can explain it than if it's presented by a rancher who's going to look, to them, like he has a personal axe to grind. You're an interested party, Caleb. Your land is at stake. I'm the one who can make this about the pattern, not the property.
Caleb was quiet for a long moment, turning it over, and Clara could see the competing impulses working behind his expression. The protectiveness, the pride, the practical calculation, and underneath all of it, the grudging acknowledgement that she was right. "All right," he said, "but I'm going with you, and if they try to dismiss you, I'll be there to make sure they don't." I would expect nothing less. The Federal Territorial Office occupied the upper floor of a sandstone building on Last Chance Gulch, and the official they were directed to, a man named Josiah Crane, held the title of Deputy Territorial Land Commissioner and had a face built for skepticism. Heavy brows, a mouth that defaulted to a thin line, and eyes that moved with the rapid, calculating attention of someone who had heard a great many claims in his career and believed very few of them. "Mr. Westridge," he said, shaking Caleb's hand without standing from behind his desk, "I understand you have a boundary matter you'd like to discuss." "I do, but Mrs. Hayes is the one who will be presenting it. She's done the work." Crane's gaze shifted to Clara, and she saw it. The flicker of reassessment. The brief recalibration of a man adjusting his expectations downward. She'd seen that look enough times in her life to have stopped being wounded by it, and started instead using it. A person who expected less of you was a person more easily surprised, and surprise, in Clara's experience, was often the first crack in resistance. "Ma'am," Crane said, with a courtesy so thin it barely qualified. "Mr. Crane." Clara set her document case on the desk and opened it with hands that were, she noted with some private satisfaction, perfectly steady. "I'll be as brief as the material allows. What I'm going to show you is evidence of a coordinated land fraud operation spanning at least 7 properties across this county, conducted over a period of approximately 6 years, involving the deliberate falsification of territorial survey records, the corruption of county filings, the use of a paid agent placed inside a working ranch to sabotage its records, and the systematic acquisition of stolen acreage through below-market purchases from owners who were never informed that their boundaries had been illegally altered." The thin line of Crane's mouth shifted, very slightly, and Clara recognized with relief that it was not the shift of dismissal, but of attention. The involuntary response of a man whose professional interest had been engaged despite his personal inclinations. "That's a substantial claim," he said. "It's a claim I can support." She began laying out the documents one by one in the order she'd arranged them, the chronological chain she'd built over weeks of work, each piece labeled and annotated in her careful hand. "This is the original 1874 survey for the Westridge property. This is the 1881 supplementary filing that altered the eastern boundary by 60 acres. And this?" She placed the certified copy they'd obtained from Avery on their first visit. "Is the authorization record for that supplementary filing, bearing the personal signature of Gideon Whitmore as an interested party." Crane picked up the authorization record and studied it for a long moment, and Clara watched something change behind his eyes. Not conviction, not yet, but the beginning of it. The first reluctant recognition that what he was looking at was not the grievance of a disgruntled rancher, but something considerably more serious. "Go on," he said. She went on. For the better part of 2 hours, she walked Crane through the entire case, the payment stubs to WL, the banking connection through Consolidated Territorial Trust, the pattern of supplementary filings across 7 properties, the below-market sales, The timeline that showed Whitmore land and cattle's formation predating all the boundary adjustments, establishing the legal infrastructure before the theft began. She explained what she could prove, acknowledged what she could only infer, and drew the distinction between the two with a precision that she could see, with each passing minute, was earning something from Crane that his initial manner had not promised. Respect. Caleb, sitting to one side, said almost nothing throughout. He watched Clara work, and there was something in his face that Clara, had she looked, might have recognized as the expression of a man understanding, fully and for the first time, the scope of what he had found outside the mercantile in cold water. When she finished, Crane sat back in his chair and was quiet for a long time. The clock on the wall ticked. Outside, the sounds of Helena's afternoon, wagons, voices, the distant whistle of a train, filtered through the window like noise from another world. "Mrs. Hayes," he said at last, "how long have you been working on this?" "Since early October, approximately 7 weeks. In 7 weeks, you've assembled a more thorough evidentiary record than most investigators produce in a year. I had access to the primary documents and a great deal of motivation, Mr. Crane. The combination tends to be efficient." Something that might have been the ghost of a smile crossed Crane's face before his professional gravity reclaimed it. "I'm not going to sit here and tell you this is enough for a federal case. It isn't. Not yet. What it is enough for me to authorize a formal investigation, and that's what I intend to do. If what you've described is accurate, and I believe it very likely is, then this is not a civil boundary dispute. This is a criminal matter involving the falsification of federal territorial records, and it falls under federal jurisdiction." Clara felt something loosen in her chest, a knot she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten it was there. "What happens next?" "I send what you've given me to the U.S. Marshal's office and to the Territorial Attorney General. They'll assign investigators, federal investigators, not county, who will conduct their own examination of the records, interview witnesses, and build a case for prosecution. In the meantime, I would strongly recommend that you and Mr. Westridge refrain from any further contact with Whitmore or his representatives, and that you take reasonable precautions for your safety and the safety of your property." "And the other ranchers?" Clara asked. "The ones Reese is approaching with settlement offers right now, while we're sitting here? If they sign those settlements before the investigation reaches them, they'll have given up land they don't know was stolen, and Whitmore will have clean title to it." Crane considered this. "I can send word to the county office instructing them to place a hold on all boundary-related filings and property transfers involving Whitmore land and cattle, effective immediately. That should prevent any settlement from becoming official until the investigation is complete." "Can you do that today?" "I can try." "Please try," Clara said, and there was nothing commanding in her voice, only the quiet urgency of a woman who understood that paper moves slower than the men it was meant to stop, and that every day of delay was a day in which someone else's land might disappear into a drawer. They left Crane's office in the late afternoon, stepping out into the cold Helena air, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. They walked side by side along the boardwalk, past shops and offices and people going about the ordinary business of a territorial capital, and Clara felt the strangeness of it, the contrast between the mundane world flowing around them and the weight of what they'd just set in motion. "You were extraordinary in there," Caleb said. "Stop saying that." "I'll stop saying it when it stops being true." Clara shook her head, but something in her softened despite herself. "I was scared the entire time. My hands were shaking under the desk for the first 20 minutes. "I know, I saw." "And you didn't say anything?" "What would I have said? Don't be scared?" "You had every reason to be scared. You walked into a federal office and told a man who didn't want to listen that one of the territory's biggest investors is a criminal. The fact that your hand shook while you did it doesn't diminish what you did. If anything, it makes it more impressive." Clara stopped walking and looked at him, really looked. And for a moment the street noise and the cold and the weight of everything that was still ahead of them fell away, and there was only this, a man standing in front of her who saw her clearly, who had seen her clearly from the beginning, who had never once tried to make her smaller than she was. "When we get back to the ranch," she said, "I'm going to need to tell Evan something about what's happening. Something honest enough that he doesn't feel lied to and gentle enough that he can sleep at night. I haven't figured out how to do both yet." "You'll figure it out. You have a great deal of faith in me, Caleb Westridge." I have an appropriate amount of faith in you, Clara Hayes. It just happens to be quite a lot. They collected the children from the boarding house, Lily delighted to see her mother, Evan, quiet and watchful as always, and began the journey back the next morning, the certified copies and Crane's commitment traveling with them like cargo that was both precious and dangerous. The kind of thing you carried knowing that whoever wanted it gone would be coming for it sooner rather than later. The trouble came faster than either of them had anticipated. They were 3 hours from cold water, the late afternoon light going bronze across the foothills, when Tom Pruitt met them on the road, riding hard, his face tight with the particular urgency of a man delivering news he wished he didn't have. "There's been trouble at the ranch," he said, pulling up alongside the wagon. "Last night, while you were gone, somebody got into the office." Clara felt the blood leave her face. The office? What was taken? "That's the thing, ma'am. As far as we can tell, nothing was taken, but the place was torn apart. Desk drawers emptied, filing cabinet opened, papers scattered everywhere. Whoever it was, they were looking for something, and they were looking hard." Caleb's jaw had gone rigid. "Did anyone see them?" Frank heard something around midnight, but by the time he got up there, whoever it was had gone. Horse tracks heading east toward the Drummond claim. Could have been one person, could have been two. Hard to tell in the dark. Clara's mind was already racing, sorting through what she'd left behind and what she'd brought with her. The original documents, the surveys, the payment stubs, the banking records. She'd taken the most critical pieces with her to Helena. But her notes, the copies she'd made, the annotated map showing the pattern across 7 properties, those had been in the desk. "My working copies," she said. "The notes I'd been compiling. They were in the second drawer." Tom hesitated. "The second drawer was one of the ones they emptied, ma'am. I can't say for certain what's missing until you've had a chance to look through it yourself, but it wasn't left tidy." Clara closed her eyes briefly, and Caleb saw her hands tighten on the edge of the wagon seat, the knuckles going white. "It doesn't matter," she said, opening her eyes with a steadiness that cost her more than she would ever admit. "It doesn't matter, because the originals are right here, and the certified copies are with us, and the federal case file is in Josiah Crane's office in Helena, where nobody short of the territorial government can touch it. They're too late. They just don't know it yet." "But they know you've been building something," Caleb said, his voice low. "And they know it was important enough to break into a ranch house for." "Which means Whitmore is scared," Clara said. "A man who's confident doesn't send someone to ransack an office in the middle of the night. He sends his lawyer with another settlement offer. This is the behavior of a man who's just learned that his careful, quiet 6-year operation is in danger of coming apart, and he's trying to destroy the evidence before it goes any further. He's 6 hours too late for that. He is. But he doesn't know that yet, and when he finds out, when Crane's hold order reaches the county office, and word gets out that there's a federal investigation, he's going to know exactly where it came from and exactly who put it together." She looked at the children. Lily had fallen asleep again in the back of the wagon, bundled in blankets, oblivious. Evan was awake, watching the adults with those 2 old eyes, reading the tension in their faces the way he'd learned to read every adult expression since the world started breaking around him. "Evan," Clara said, turning to face him directly, "when we get home, some things are going to be different for a little while. Mr. Westridge's office had some trouble while we were away, and some important papers got mixed up. That's going to mean more people coming to the ranch, people who work for the government, people whose job it is to make sure everyone's land is where it's supposed to be. They're the good kind of people. You don't need to be afraid of them." "What about the bad kind?" Evan asked. And the question, in its directness, was so perfectly his that Clara had to swallow before she could answer. "The bad kind are the reason the good kind are coming. And that's how it's supposed to work, sweetheart. When someone does something wrong, other people come to make it right. It doesn't always happen as fast as we'd like, and it doesn't always happen perfectly, but it happens." "Because of you," Evan said. "You found the wrong thing, in the papers." "I did." "Is that why someone came to Mr. Westridge's office? Because they wanted to stop you from finding it?" Clara looked at her son. 5 years old, the age at which most children were concerned with games and animals and whether there would be something sweet after supper, and felt the old ache of knowing that his childhood had been compressed into something harder and narrower than any child should be. "Yes," she said. "That's why." "But they didn't stop you." "No, they didn't." Evan nodded, once,
with a satisfaction that was almost adult in its quietness, and then he turned back to watching the road, and Clara blinked hard against the sting behind her eyes and faced forward. They reached the ranch at dusk. The office was exactly as Tom had described it, ransacked, papers scattered across the floor and desk, drawers pulled out and upended, the filing cabinet's lock forced open with what looked like a pry bar. Clara walked through it slowly, taking inventory with the systematic attention of a woman for whom order was not merely a preference, but a defense, cataloging what was present and what was gone. They took my annotated map, she said, after 20 minutes of sorting, the one showing all 7 properties and the pattern of boundary adjustments, and my working copies of the payment stubs. Can you rebuild them? I can rebuild the map from memory. I've looked at it long enough to have every property and every number in my head. The payment stubs are a loss, but the originals are still with us, and Crane has certified copies. So they got copies, not the case itself. Copies and notes. Enough to tell Whitmore exactly how much we know, and exactly how we know it, but not enough to destroy the evidence we've already placed with the federal office. Clara straightened, looking around the violated room, and something in her expression hardened in a way Caleb hadn't seen before. Not anger exactly, though anger was part of it, but a kind of grim, immovable resolve. In fact, she said slowly, this may actually help us. How? Because Crane told us to take reasonable precautions for our safety. A break-in at the ranch, clearly targeting the records related to the investigation, is evidence of intimidation, evidence that Whitmore's people are actively trying to suppress the case. If we report this to Crane, it strengthens the argument for federal intervention, not just in the land records, but in the conduct of Whitmore's agents. Caleb looked at her for a long moment, and then he laughed. A short, tired, genuine sound, the first real laugh she'd heard from him in weeks. They broke in to weaken your case and ended up making it stronger. Paper cuts both ways, Clara said. It's one of the few things I've always been able to depend on. She wrote to Crane that night, a detailed account of the break-in, what was taken, what it indicated about the awareness and intentions of Whitmore's operatives, and gave the letter to Tom to carry to Helena the following morning. Then she rebuilt her annotated map from memory, sitting at the damaged desk in the lamplight, drawing the property lines and the boundary adjustments and the dates and the dollar figures with a precision that would have impressed Crane had he been there to see it. The days that followed were a strange kind of waiting, the charged electric stillness that comes after a match has been struck, but before the fire has decided which direction to run. Word of the hold order reached Coldwater within the week, and the town's reaction was not, as Clara had feared, unanimously hostile. It was split, cleanly and painfully, along the line that divides people who prefer comfortable silence from people who prefer uncomfortable truth. Bill Carver, the 70-year-old rancher whom Frank had asked to wait, came to the ranch on a Sunday morning, hat in hand, his weathered face arranged in an expression that Clara recognized as the specific discomfort of a proud man who has realized he almost made a terrible mistake. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, standing in the yard, because he seemed to feel the occasion required the open air rather than the intimacy of a room. "Frank told me what you found. I'll admit I didn't believe half of it at first." "What made you believe the other half?" "I went home and pulled out my own survey papers, the ones my father filed when he proved up the claim in '71. Compared them against the county copy I got when I had the boundary restaked 5 years back. 38 acres, Mrs. Hayes. That's how much I'm short. 38 acres that were mine on my father's filing and aren't mine on the county's, and I never noticed because I'm an old man who trusts the records office to keep honest count." "You're not the only one, Mr. Carver. I know that now." He turned his hat in his hands, working the brim. "I came to say 2 things. First, thank you, and I'm sorry I didn't listen sooner. Second, the Henshaw place across the creek? Margaret Henshaw found the same thing when she checked her papers. 42 acres. She's furious, Mrs. Hayes, the kind of furious that comes from a woman who raised 4 children on that land and just learned someone's been stealing it out from under her one survey at a time. I'd like to speak with her," Clara said, "and with anyone else who's found discrepancies. Every additional property strengthens the federal case." "I'll tell her. I'll tell all of them." Bill Carver put his hat back on, and something in his eyes, the hard, bright look of a man who has found, very late in life, something worth fighting for, reminded Clara, with a pang she didn't expect, of her own face in the mirror on the morning she'd decided to stay. Over the following week, 4 more ranchers came to the Westridge place with their papers, their discrepancies, their anger. Margaret Henshaw, a small, fierce woman in her 50s, who spoke with the clipped precision of someone who had never in her life wasted a word. Jack Murdoch, who had lost 61 acres and didn't know it until his wife, at Margaret's urging, compared their old filing against the county's. The Sullivans, a young couple who had bought their claim only 3 years earlier and discovered that the acreage described in their purchase deed didn't match the acreage described in the county survey by a margin of 27 acres, the difference having been quietly transferred, on paper, to Whitmore land and cattle before the Sullivans ever signed the deed. Clara met with each of them at the ranch house office, now restored to its working order, and took their documents and recorded their accounts with the same patient, thorough attention she'd applied to Caleb's records, weaving each new thread into the larger pattern, each stolen acre strengthening the web of evidence that was tightening, strand by strand, around Gideon Whitmore's operation. "You've turned my ranch into a law office," Caleb said one evening, standing in the doorway of the office where Clara was working late, surrounded by papers from 5 different properties. "Would you prefer I turned it back into a filing disaster?" "I'd prefer you ate supper at some point before midnight. Bess made stew, and Evan's been asking for you." Clara set down her pen and looked up, and the tiredness was visible in her face in a way she usually managed to hide. "I keep thinking I'm almost done," she said. "And then someone else arrives with another set of papers and another 40 acres, and I realize it's bigger than I thought, and I have to start again." "You don't have to start again. You have to add to what's already there. There's a difference, and it's an important one, because one of those things is endless and the other has a finish line." "When did you become the optimist in this arrangement?" "Roughly the same time you became the one who forgets to eat." He stepped into the room and set a plate of stew on the corner of the desk, moving a stack of county filings to make room. "Eat. The Whitmore case will still be here in 30 minutes. Clara ate, and it was good. And the simple act of sitting still and doing something that wasn't work or worry or the careful management of her own fear felt, for a few minutes, like the most extravagant luxury she'd experienced in months. "I got a letter back from Crane today," she said between bites. "He's assigned 2 federal investigators. They'll be arriving in Coldwater within the fortnight. He wants all the materials, mine and the other ranchers, compiled and ready for them when they get here." "That's fast." The break-in helped. Crane used it in his request to the marshal's office as evidence that the case required urgent attention. He also mentioned and I think this is significant, that Whitmore's name has come up in connection with similar complaints in 2 other territories. Nothing proven yet, but enough to suggest that what's happening here isn't an isolated operation. Caleb sat down across from her, and the expression on his face was one she'd come to recognize. The look of a man recalibrating the scale of what he'd thought he was dealing with. 2 other territories, he said. If that's true, and if the pattern is the same, falsified surveys, corrupted filings, paid insiders, pressured settlements, then this isn't just a Montana land grab, it's a system, a business model. A man like that doesn't stop voluntarily. No, a man like that stops when someone makes him stop. And right now, Caleb, we're the ones making him stop, not because we're powerful or connected or rich, but because I found a 60-acre discrepancy in a supplementary filing and wouldn't let it go. Because you wouldn't let it go, Caleb corrected. Not we, you. Clara shook her head. You brought me in off that sidewalk. You let me look at your records. You rode to Garnet to find McGill. You stood next to me in Crane's office without once trying to take over or talk over me. This is yours too, Caleb. Don't pretend it isn't. He looked at her, and the thing that moved in his face was the thing neither of them had named, the thing that lived in the space between what they said to each other and what they meant, and it was getting harder with each passing day to pretend it wasn't there. Your stew's getting cold, he said. It's already cold. Then eat it cold. You need the strength. We've got federal investigators arriving in 2 weeks, a land baron whose enterprise is coming apart, and I suspect things are going to get considerably more complicated before they get simpler. Clara finished the stew and washed the plate in the kitchen and walked back to the cottage in the dark with the cold Montana air sharp in her lungs and the stars hard and bright above the mountains. And she checked on her children. Lily sprawled in sleep with the boneless grace of the very young,
Evan curled on his side with one arm around the wooden horse Caleb had carved for him 2 weeks earlier without being asked. And she sat at the window and looked out at the dark, and she did not feel safe. Exactly. Because safety was a thing she'd stopped believing in as a permanent condition, but she felt something that was, in some ways, better. She felt ready. Ready for whatever was coming. Ready because she had built something that could withstand it. Not just a legal case, though the case was strong, but a place, a structure. A small, fierce life carved out of abandonment and necessity and stubbornness and the gradual, imperfect accumulation of trust between two people who had both been given good reasons never to trust again. She went to bed and slept soundly, and in the morning she rose early and walked up to the office and began the work of compiling every document, every account, every stolen acre into a single, comprehensive file that would be waiting on the desk when the federal investigators arrived. The complete record of a conspiracy built on the assumption that nobody would ever look closely enough to see it. Undone by a woman who had looked closely because looking closely was the only skill the world had left her, and she had decided, finally and completely, to use it not merely to survive, but to fight. The federal investigators arrived on a Tuesday morning in early December, 2 men in dark coats riding a hired wagon up the long approach to the ranch house, with the unhurried deliberation of professionals who understood that the appearance of calm was, in their line of work, as important as the substance of it. The first was a tall, angular man named Ridley, who had the careful eyes of someone accustomed to reading documents the way other men read faces, looking for what was hidden rather than what was shown. The second was shorter, broader, named Polk, and he carried himself with the particular quiet confidence of a man who had spent years asking questions that people didn't want to answer and had stopped being bothered by the discomfort it caused. Clara met them at the door of the office with the compiled case file on the desk behind her, every document organized, every connection annotated, every gap acknowledged, and she shook their hands with a steadiness she'd earned over weeks of preparation and a sleepless night she would not have admitted to anyone except, perhaps, Caleb. "Mrs. Hayes," Ridley said, with a courtesy that was, she noted immediately, several degrees warmer than Josiah Crane's had been on their first meeting. "Deputy Commissioner Crane speaks highly of your work." "Mr. Crane is generous. The work speaks for itself, if you'll let me walk you through it." She spent the better part of that first day doing exactly that, laying out the chain of evidence with the same methodical patience she'd used in Crane's office, but with more confidence now, because the case had grown since Helena. Where she'd presented 7 properties to Crane, she now had 11, each with its own documented discrepancy, its own stolen acreage, its own thread connecting back to the central web of Whitmore land and cattle's operation. The payment stubs to WL, the banking connection through Consolidated Territorial Trust, the supplementary filings with Whitmore's signature, the testimony Caleb had obtained from Duff McGill in Garnet. All of it laid out in a sequence that moved, as Ridley later told Polk over supper at the boarding house in town, with the clarity of a prosecution brief written by someone who had never been inside a courtroom but understood, instinctively, what a jury would need to see. "She's not a lawyer," Polk said. "No, she's a bookkeeper who got stranded in a frontier town by a man who didn't keep his word, which, if you think about it, makes everything she's done considerably more impressive." The investigators spent a week at Westridge, working through Clara's files, conducting their own examination of the county records. Harwood, the clerk, treated their presence with the particular nervous deference of a man who suspects his long tenure of comfortable neglect is about to become professionally embarrassing. And interviewing the ranchers who had come forward, Bill Carver, Margaret Henshaw, Jack Murdoch, the Sullivans, others who had heard, through the particular rapid telegraph of rural communities, that something was happening at the Westridge place and had come to check their own papers and found, in most cases, exactly what Clara had predicted they would find. On the 4th day, Ridley asked Clara a question that caught her off guard. "Mrs. Hayes, when you first noticed the discrepancy in the 1881 filing, the 60-acre drift, what made you pursue it rather than dismiss it as a surveying error?" Clara thought about it longer than she expected to. "I suppose," she said slowly, "it was because the drift only went one direction. Errors are random. They scatter. This didn't scatter. It moved with purpose, even though it was trying very hard to look like it hadn't. I've spent most of my adult life around numbers, Mr. Ridley. And I've learned that numbers lie only when someone makes them lie. And when they do, there's always a seam where the lie doesn't quite fit the truth around it. That seam was what I saw. And you trusted your own observation enough to act on it, even though you had no formal training in land surveying or fraud investigation.
I trusted that what I was seeing was real, yes. Whether I trusted myself enough to do anything about it, that took longer. I spent a week telling myself I might be imagining the pattern before I said anything to Caleb. She paused, and something honest moved across her face, something that hadn't been there in the early weeks, when the armor of competence had been all she'd had to protect herself. I think women, in particular, are taught to doubt what they see when what they see is inconvenient. I nearly did. The fact that I didn't is probably less about courage and more about the fact that I had 2 children sleeping in a cottage a quarter-mile from a fence that someone had just cut, and when it's your children's safety at stake, you stop having the luxury of self-doubt.
Ridley wrote something in his notebook, and Clara never learned what it was, but she suspected from the way he looked at her afterward that it was not strictly an evidentiary note. On the 6th day, something happened that none of them had anticipated. Harlan Reese returned to Coldwater. He did not come to the ranch this time. He went instead to the courthouse, where Harwood was in the process of providing the federal investigators with access to every boundary filing in the county's records, and he stood in the doorway of the records office with his smooth face arranged in an expression of professional concern and asked, in a voice pitched to Carrie, what exactly was going on. Ridley, who happened to be present, looked at him with the mild, unimpressed gaze of a man who had been waiting for exactly this. And you are? Harlan Reese, representing Whitmore Land and Cattle. I understand there's been some kind of federal hold placed on my client's filings, and I'm here to inquire on what authority. The authority of the Deputy Territorial Land Commissioner, acting on evidence of systematic fraud involving the falsification of territorial survey records. Your client's name appears on several of the relevant documents. I'd recommend, Mr. Reese, that you advise Mr. Whitmore to retain criminal defense counsel at his earliest convenience. The blood drained from Reese's face with a speed that Clara, who was standing behind Ridley with a stack of files in her arms, found deeply, privately satisfying in a way she would not have been proud of but could not quite suppress. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. I'll need to speak with my client, he said. You do that, Ridley said. And while you're speaking with him, you might want to mention that we'll be requesting his personal financial records from Consolidated Territorial Trust within the week. Reese left. Clara watched his buggy disappear down the street, and something in her chest, not triumph exactly, because the fight was not over, and she had learned, the hard way, the cost of celebrating too soon, but something close to it, a fierce, quiet satisfaction that felt like the first full breath she'd taken in weeks. That was gratifying, she said. It was procedurally appropriate, Ridley said, without quite hiding a smile. The gratification was incidental. The investigation expanded rapidly after that. Within 2 weeks of Ridley and Polk's arrival, the scope had widened from Coldwater to 3 adjacent counties, and the number of affected properties had grown from 11 to 17. 17 ranching families who had lost land, some a few dozen acres, some considerably more, through a systematic campaign of falsified surveys, corrupted filings, and pressured settlements that stretched back nearly a decade. Duff McGill, true to the cautious word he'd given Caleb and Garnett, came down from his claim and provided a sworn deposition to the federal investigators, describing in detail the letters Larson had received from Butte, the hours Larson had spent altering records in the ranch office, and the warning Larson had given him before departing, that the people behind the operation had long reach and no patience for interference. McGill's hands trembled when he signed the deposition, and Clara, who was present, felt a complicated sympathy for a man whose fear she understood, even as she recognized that his silence, maintained for years, had been part of what allowed the theft to continue. I should have said something sooner, McGill told her afterward, standing outside the ranch house with his hat pulled low against the December wind. I know that. You're saying it now, Clara said. That's what matters. Does it? Those families lost land while I was sitting on a hillside in Garnett, pretending I didn't know anything. You were afraid. Fear doesn't make you a villain, Mr. McGill. It makes you human. The choice to come forward despite the fear, that's what counts, and you made it. McGill looked at her for a long moment,
and something in his weathered face eased, not quite to peace, but to something approaching it. "Westridge is lucky he found you, Mrs. Hayes."
I'm not sure luck had much to do with it. As I recall, I was standing on a sidewalk with no money and 2 hungry children, and he happened to need a bookkeeper. The rest of it, all of this, was just paying attention. The federal case against Gideon Whitmore was filed in late January, 3 months after Clara had first noticed the 60-acre discrepancy in a supplementary survey and set her chin and decided to find out why. The charges were comprehensive: federal land fraud, conspiracy to falsify territorial records, bribery of a county official. The county surveyor who had co-signed the fraudulent supplementary filings turned out to have received regular payments from Consolidated Territorial Trust over the same period as larceny, and the unlawful acquisition of property through deception. 17 counts in total, 1 for each family whose land had been stolen, each count carrying the weight of acreage measured and documented and sworn to by the people who had worked it, who had raised children on it, who had believed, because they had no reason not to, that the lines drawn on paper reflected the truth of the ground beneath their feet. Whitmore was arrested in Chicago in early February. Clara learned about it secondhand from a letter Crane sent to Caleb, and she read it at the office desk on a cold, bright morning when the snow on the mountains was so white it hurt to look at. And she set the letter down and sat very still for a long time. And Caleb, who had been standing in the doorway watching her, came in and sat across from her and waited. "It's done," she said. "Not quite. There's still the trial. The trial is paperwork. The hard part, the finding, the assembling, the making someone listen, that's done." "How do you feel?" Clara considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, because Caleb had asked it with seriousness, and she owed him an honest answer. "I feel tired," she said, "and relieved, and angry, still, underneath the relief, because 17 families lost land and years of security, and the fact that they're getting it back doesn't undo the years they didn't know it was gone. And I feel, I don't know what to call it, not proud, exactly, something less comfortable than that." "What's less comfortable than proud?" "The awareness that I almost didn't do any of it, that I spent the first week looking at that discrepancy and telling myself I was imagining things. If I'd been a little less stubborn, or a little more tired, or if Evan hadn't needed me to be the kind of person who doesn't look away from things, I might have filed those surveys back in the drawer and never said a word, and Whitmore would still be out there taking land, piece by piece, from people who never knew to look." "But you didn't file them back in the drawer." "No, I didn't." "Then the almost doesn't matter. What matters is what you actually did." The trial took place in Helena in March, and Clara was called as a witness. She traveled there alone this time. Bess had the children, and Evan, now 6, had arrived at an age and a confidence where her absence for a few days no longer produced the particular tight-faced anxiety it once had, which was, she thought, one of the quietest and most important victories of the past several months, more important in some ways than anything that would happen in the courtroom. The courtroom was cold, high-ceilinged, filled with the particular hush of a place where consequential things were being decided by people in uncomfortable chairs. Gideon Whitmore sat at the defense table, and Clara saw him clearly for the first time. A heavy-set man in his 50s with a florid face and the careful grooming of someone accustomed to being taken seriously, whose eyes, when they moved to Clara as she took the witness stand, carried not the menace she'd half expected, but something worse, the flat, disinterested assessment of a man who still, even now, could not quite believe that what he'd built had been dismantled by a woman he'd never bothered to learn the name of. The prosecutor, a young territorial attorney named Fenton, who had the nervous energy of someone arguing the most significant case of his career, walked Clara through her testimony methodically, how she'd come to be at Westridge Ranch, how she'd discovered the discrepancy, how she'd traced the pattern across multiple properties, how she'd assembled the evidence and presented it to the federal office. Clara answered each question with the same clarity she'd brought to every stage of the investigation. And when the defense attorney, a far more formidable presence than Harlan Reese, a silver-haired veteran named Cortland brought in from Chicago to mount what the newspapers were already calling a vigorous defense, rose to cross-examine her, she met his questions with a composure that did not waver even when he suggested, with considerable rhetorical skill, that she was an unqualified woman with a personal grudge who had mistaken clerical inconsistencies for criminal conspiracy. "Mr. Cortland," Clara said, after one particularly pointed insinuation. "I have no grudge against your client. I had never heard his name before I found it on a document authorizing the theft of 60 acres of land that didn't belong to him. My qualification, such as it is, consists of the ability to read, to add, and to notice when numbers don't agree with each other. If those skills are sufficient to dismantle your client's operation, I'd suggest the operation was not as carefully constructed as he believed." A murmur ran through the courtroom, and Clara saw from the corner of her eye the faintest crack appear in Cortland's silver-haired confidence. The jury deliberated for 2 days. Clara waited in the hallway of the courthouse because she could not bring herself to leave, and Caleb waited with her, sitting on a hard wooden bench, saying little, his presence beside her carrying a weight and a warmth that said everything he didn't. "Whatever happens in there," he said, on the morning of the second day, "what you've done stands. The evidence stands. The 17 families who got their land back, that stands. A verdict is a piece of paper, Clara. The truth is what you built, and nobody can take it back." "I know," she said, "but I want the piece of paper too." "I know you do." The verdict came down at 3:30 on a Thursday afternoon. Guilty on all 17 counts of federal land fraud. Guilty on 4 counts of conspiracy to falsify territorial records. Guilty on 2 counts of bribery of a public official. Gideon Whitmore sat motionless as the verdicts were read, and something went out of him. Not dramatically, not with the collapse of a man who'd expected to be saved, but with the slow deflation of someone who had always, at some level, known this was possible and had simply been betting that nobody would ever care enough to make it happen. The sentencing was swift. 12 years in federal prison, forfeiture of all properties acquired through fraudulent means, and a fine that, while substantial, mattered less than the fact of the conviction itself, which sent, as Crane would later describe it in his report to the territorial governor, a clear message that land fraud in Montana Territory would be pursued with the full weight of federal authority. 3 county officials resigned in the weeks that followed, including the surveyor who had co-signed the falsified filings. Consolidated Territorial Trust was placed under federal investigation. Harlan Reese quietly relocated to Oregon and was never heard from in Montana again. And across Coldwater and the surrounding counties, 17 ranching families received official notification that their boundaries had been restored to their original, legal positions, the positions Clara had found in the 1874 survey, the document that had started all of it, the first thread in a web that a woman with 2 children and no money and a broken promise had pulled until the whole thing came apart. Clara returned to Coldwater after the trial with the particular exhaustion of someone who has been running on purpose for months and has, finally, been given permission to stop. She stepped down from the stagecoach, and Evan was there, running toward her across the hard-packed dirt of the main street with a grin she hadn't seen on his face since before his father died, and she dropped to her knees and caught him and held him so tightly he protested, laughing, that she was squashing him. "Did you win?" he asked. "We won." "All of it?" "All of it." Lily, toddling behind her brother with Bess's steadying hand at her back, reached Clara a moment later and flung herself into the embrace with the uncomplicated joy of a 3-year-old who didn't understand courts or verdicts but understood that her mother was home. And Clara sat there on the ground in the middle of Coldwater's one real street and held her children and felt something she hadn't felt in so long she'd almost forgotten what it was. Not safety, exactly, and not triumph, but the bone-deep relief of a woman who had fought for something and won it, and could now, for the first time in longer than she cared to count, stop fighting and simply be present in the life she'd managed, against considerable odds, to build. Caleb was waiting at the ranch, standing on the porch of the main house with his hands in his pockets and the particular expression of a man who has been waiting for someone and is trying not to show how much the waiting has cost him. He didn't say anything as Clara walked up the path with a child on each hand. He just looked at her, and she looked at him. And whatever the thing was that they hadn't named, the thing that had been growing in the space between shared work and shared danger, and long evenings in the office, and the sound of his voice saying her name for the first time, it was, Clara understood now, something that didn't need naming. It needed choosing. And choosing was something she knew how to do. The offer from Crane came 2 weeks later, delivered by letter to the ranch, a permanent position in the Territorial Land Office in Billings, reviewing filings and investigating discrepancies, at a salary that would have been, by any reasonable measure, the most financially secure arrangement Clara had ever been offered. It was a good job, an important job, the kind of job that would have given her children stability, education, a future in a real town with a real school and a real community that didn't view them as the remnants of a mail-order arrangement that had gone wrong. She thought about it for 3 days. She walked the boundary of the ranch, the eastern line now properly staked and fenced, the 60 acres restored to Westridge land where they'd always belonged. She watched Evan help Caleb with the horses, the boy's small hands confident now where they'd once been hesitant, his voice carrying across the corral with a freedom she hadn't heard in it since before his father died. She watched Lily chase Bess's chickens around the yard, shrieking with laughter, a child so thoroughly at home in a place that had never been intended as her home, that the distinction had ceased to mean anything. She sat with Caleb on the porch one evening after the children were in bed, the Montana sky enormous and cold above them, and she told him about the offer. "Billings," he said after a long silence. "Billings. Good salary. Important work. The kind of position I wouldn't have dared imagine 6 months ago. Are you going to take it?" Clara looked out at the dark shape of the mountains, the line of the foothills against the sky, the faint silver thread of the creek winding through the cottonwoods below the cottage. She thought about the train platform and the empty promise and the woman she'd been when she stepped down onto it, frightened, alone, carrying everything she owned in one bag and everything she was in the fierce, exhausted determination not to let her children see her break. "No," she said. Caleb turned to look at her, and she saw the thing in his face that he'd been carrying for weeks, maybe longer, the hope he'd been too careful to show, the want he'd been too respectful to speak. "Why not?" he asked, and his voice was careful, as if the answer mattered more than he was willing to admit. "Because I've spent 2 years moving toward something, away from a dead husband, toward a promised one, away from that broken promise, toward this ranch. Every step has been toward something else, something next, something that was supposed to be the place where I finally stopped and said, this is where I belong. And I'm tired of moving, Caleb. I'm tired of the next place. I want this place. Not because it's perfect, it isn't, and I know that better than most, having spent 3 months cataloging every piece of paper in it, but because it's where my children have stopped being afraid. It's where my son started laughing again. It's where my daughter learned to run without holding on to my hand. And it's where I... She stopped, and the honesty of what she was about to say caught in her throat. Where you what? Where I stopped being the woman things happened to. Where I started being the woman who made things happen. And I don't want to leave that behind for a salary and a desk in Billings, no matter how good the salary is. I want to stay here and keep being the person I became in this place. If you'll have me. If I'll have you, Caleb repeated, and something in his voice broke open, quietly, the way ice breaks on a creek in early spring, not with a crash, but with a slow, steady yielding to warmth. Clara, I have been trying, for longer than I care to admit, not to ask you to stay, because I didn't want you to stay for the wrong reasons. I didn't want you to stay because you had nowhere else to go, or because you felt obligated, or because this ranch was better than the alternatives. I wanted, if you ever chose to stay, for it to be because you wanted this life, this place, this family, Clara said. That's the word you're looking for. Yes, that's the word. Then yes, this family, imperfect, unplanned, built out of a broken promise and a messy desk and a 60-acre discrepancy that neither of us expected to find. This family. Caleb reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, and Clara let him, and neither of them said anything else for a long time, because some moments are better served by silence than by any words a person could arrange. The winter that followed was the hardest Coldwater had seen in years, the kind of winter that tested everything: fences, livestock, patience, the human capacity to endure darkness and cold without losing the thread of whatever kept you going. Clara and the children moved into the main house in January, not because anyone made a declaration about it, but because it happened the way practical things happen on a ranch. A broken stove in the cottage, a night spent in the spare room that became 2 nights, then a week, then the quiet realization that there was no reason to go back and every reason to stay. Evan got his own room, the first he'd ever had, and filled it with the particular treasures of a 6-year-old boy who had been given, for the first time in his memory, permission to accumulate stones from the creek, feathers, a carved wooden horse, a collection of interesting sticks that Clara periodically threatened to thin, but never quite did. Lily learned to say Caleb's name, or a version of it, Kaba, and used it with the imperious frequency of a child who has discovered that naming a person gives you a certain power over them. Clara kept the books. She kept them with the same meticulous attention she'd brought to them from the first day, but the books themselves were different now. No longer the chaotic evidence of a ranch neglected, but the orderly record of a ranch running well, debts paid, accounts settled. The financial life of the place laid out in her careful handwriting like a story of its own. A story of recovery and rebuilding told in numbers that added up. On a morning in early March, when the snow was beginning to soften and the first raw, uncertain warmth of spring was making the creek run loud enough to hear from the porch, a letter arrived from Margaret Henshaw inviting Clara to a gathering of the ranching families whose land had been restored. A supper, Margaret called it, though the word didn't quite capture the scope of what she had in mind. "She's invited everyone," Caleb said, reading the letter over Clara's shoulder. "All 17 families." "She's invited us," Clara corrected. "You and me, together." "Is that what she says?" "That's what she means. Margaret Henshaw doesn't waste words, and she doesn't waste invitations." They went, all 4 of them, on a Saturday evening when the light stayed long enough to make the drive pleasant, and the Henshaw place was full of people Clara had come to know over the course of the investigation. Faces that had been frightened, or angry, or skeptical, or some combination of all 3, now gathered in a farmhouse kitchen that smelled of roasting meat and fresh bread, talking and eating and performing the particular rituals of community that are, in the end, the only reliable evidence that a group of people has decided to belong to each other. Bill Carver found Clara in the kitchen, where she was helping Margaret slice bread, and stood before her with the same hat-in-hand solemnity he'd worn when he came to the ranch months earlier. But this time, what was in his face wasn't discomfort. It was gratitude, plain and unadorned and difficult for a man of 70 to express. "I got my 38 acres back," he said, every one of them. "I know. I'm glad. My father proved up that land in 71. He died on it. My mother's buried on it. And I nearly signed it away to a man in Chicago who thought he could take it with a pen and a crooked surveyor because nobody was looking." Bill's voice roughened. "You were looking, Mrs. Hayes." "Someone had to be." "Well, someone was, and I won't forget it, and neither will anyone else in this room." Clara thanked him, and meant it, and felt the weight of his words settle into her alongside all the other weights she'd accumulated over the past months. The weight of responsibility, of consequence, of the knowledge that what she'd done had mattered, not in the abstract way that good work sometimes matters, but in the specific, tangible way of 38 acres restored to an old man whose father had died on them. That was the kind of mattering that meant something. That was the kind that stayed. Later, on the drive home, with Lily asleep in her lap and Evan drowsing against Caleb's arm, Clara sat in the wagon and watched the Montana sky do the thing it did in early spring. The stars coming out slowly, one by one, as if each one needed to be certain the dark was safe before it appeared. And she thought about the woman who had stepped off the train in cold water 5 months earlier. She tried to find that woman in herself, the frightened, furious, exhausted woman with $4 and 2 children and nothing else, and she could feel her still, underneath everything that had happened since, not gone, not erased, but absorbed, the way a tree absorbs the scar of a hard winter into the pattern of its growth. That woman was part of her the way every hard thing was part of her. Not a wound anymore, but a record. A line in the grain that said, "This is what I survived, and this is what I became because of it." She had not been rescued. She wanted to be clear about that, to herself if not to anyone else, because the story, told quickly, might sound like a rescue. A woman alone, a man who offered help, a life rebuilt. And that was not what had happened. What had happened was that a woman had been abandoned and had refused to collapse. A woman had been told by every silent stare and every closed door in a small Montana town that she was a burden, a problem, a category rather than a person. And she had answered that judgment not with argument, but with work. She had sat down at a desk piled with neglected paper, and she had done the only thing she knew how to do. She had paid attention. and her attention had uncovered a crime that had been hiding in plain sight for years because no one else had bothered to look. Caleb had given her the opportunity. She would never diminish that, and she would never pretend it hadn't mattered. But the opportunity was a door, and she was the one who'd walked through it. And what she'd found on the other side, the fraud, the evidence, the fight, she had found because of who she was, not because of who had helped her. That distinction mattered to Clara. It mattered because she had spent too much of her life having her worth defined by the men who were or weren't standing beside her. A dead husband, a vanished fiancé, a generous stranger. And she was finished with it. Her worth was her own, built from her own labor and her own stubborn refusal to look away from things that didn't add up, and it belonged to no one else. But here was the thing she'd also learned, the thing that was harder to admit, because it cut against the independence she'd fought so hard to claim. She hadn't done it alone. She couldn't have done it alone. Caleb's trust had opened the door. Bess's care had freed her hands. Tom Pruitt's honesty had given her the first alarm. Duff McGill's courage, imperfect and delayed as it was, had provided the testimony the case required. Bill Carver and Margaret Henshaw and Jack Murdoch and the Sullivans and all the others had come forward with their papers and their anger and their willingness to be part of something larger than their individual grievances. The case had not been built by one woman at a desk. It had been built by a community that didn't know it was a community until it had a reason to become one. That, Clara thought, was perhaps the most important thing she'd learned in Coldwater. That strength and independence were not the same thing, and that needing people didn't make you weak. It made you human, and the truest kind of strength was not the kind that stood alone, but the kind that stood alongside others and was made stronger by the standing. "You're thinking loudly," Caleb said, his voice low so as not to wake the children. "I'm thinking about what comes next. What comes next is spring, calving season, fixing everything the winter broke, the ordinary work of keeping a ranch alive. That sounds like enough. It's more than enough. It's a life. The kind you build one day at a time, not the kind that arrives on a train because someone promised it to you." Clara looked at him, this man she hadn't chosen so much as arrived at. Through accident and necessity and the slow, daily accumulation of trust. And she felt something she could finally identify without flinching. She felt at home. Not because the ranch was beautiful, though it was, in the stark, unforgiving way that Montana was beautiful. Not because the cottage or the main house or the office had become familiar, though they had, but because home, she understood now, was not a place at all. It was a decision. It was the daily, unremarkable, sometimes difficult choice to stay and do the work and face what came and not run from it, even when running would have been easier, even when the ground under your feet felt uncertain and the future was something you couldn't see the shape of yet. She had been running for 2 years, from Ohio to a train platform to a boarding house to a cottage on a stranger's ranch, each stop a temporary arrangement, each place a way station on the way to somewhere else. And now she was done. Not because she'd found perfection. The ranch leaked, the stove in the main house drew badly in a north wind. The books would always need keeping, and Caleb left his muddy boots by the door in a way that she suspected would irritate her for years. But because she had found something better than perfection. She had found a place where she was useful and valued and known, a place her children could grow up in without fear, a place where the work she did mattered to people who would remember it. That was enough, more than enough. It was a life. The wagon turned up the long approach to the ranch house, the wheels crunching softly on the thawing ground, and the mountain stood dark and enormous against the last of the light, and the cottonwoods along the creek were showing the first swollen buds of spring, and Evan stirred against Caleb's arm and murmured something about the horses, still half asleep, already dreaming of tomorrow's work, and Lily's small hand tightened in Clara's coat even in sleep. Holding on with the instinct of a child who has learned that holding on is how you stay. Clara Hayes had come to Coldwater with nothing. She was staying with everything that mattered. And the difference between the two, between arriving and belonging, between surviving and living, between a promise made by a stranger and a life built by your own hands, was the only story worth telling in the end. Not because it was extraordinary, because it wasn't, because it was the ordinary, daily, unglamorous miracle of a woman who refused to be defeated by what had happened to her and chose, instead, to become someone defined by what she did about it. The porch light was burning when they pulled up to the house. Clara carried Lily inside and Caleb carried Evan, and they put the children to bed in the rooms that were now, unmistakably theirs. And then they stood together in the kitchen of a house that was now unmistakably theirs too. Not by deed or contract or the kind of legal arrangement that could be filed in a county office, but by something sturdier than paper, something built from months of shared work and shared fear and shared meals, and the particular intimacy of two people who had seen each other at their worst and decided to stay anyway. "Welcome home," Caleb said. And Clara, who had been looking for home for longer than she could remember, who had traveled 1,000 miles to find it in the last place she'd expected, and in the company of a man she'd never planned on, did something she hadn't done in a very long time. She set down the weight she'd been carrying, all of it, the grief and the anger and the fear and the fierce, exhausting vigilance of a woman who'd had no one to depend on but herself. And she leaned into him, and she rested. Outside, the Montana night settled over the ranch, cold and wide and full of stars. And the creek ran loud with snowmelt, and the new fence along the eastern boundary stood straight and strong in the dark. And somewhere in the foothills a coyote called out, and another answered, and the sound of it carried across the valley like a conversation between two creatures who had found each other in the wilderness and decided, against all odds and for no reason that could be measured or surveyed or filed in any office, that they were not alone.